Stanford Prison Experiment. The Stanford Prison Experiment is one of the most shocking demonstrations of how ordinary people can transform when placed in positions of power or submission. Conducted by Philip Zimbardo. In 1971, it began as a simple simulation in the basement of Stanford University, yet within days, it spiraled into a disturbing psychological descent that exposed the fragile line between human decency and authority-driven cruelty. Volunteers were randomly assigned as guards or prisoners, but the moment uniforms, sunglasses, and cells were introduced, something terrifying awakened the guards. Once regular students slipped into roles of dominance with alarming ease, enforcing rules with growing aggression. The prisoners, stripped of identity and control, began displaying anxiety, emotional breakdowns, and helpless obedience as their sense of self eroded. What makes this experiment so mind-blowing is not just the speed of the transformation, but how quickly people surrendered to roles they knew were artificial. The mind doesn't wait for reality to change before it adapts. It responds instantly to symbols of power, confinement, and expectation. The guards pushed boundaries because they believed authority justified it. The prisoners submitted because humiliation reshaped their internal narrative. Humanity dissolved under the weight of perceived roles. It revealed the haunting truth that cruelty is not a trait reserved for the monstrous, but a potential lurking in anyone given the right environment. The experiment was meant to last 2 weeks, but was shut down after only 6 days because the psychological damage had become undeniable. Even decades later, it forces us to confront the unsettling possibility that the personas we adopt can overtake the people we think we are, reshaping our morality, our empathy, and our limits without us even realizing it. Milgram Obedience Study. The Milgram Obedience Study is one of the most unsettling revelations of how far ordinary people will go when instructed by an authority figure conducted by Stanley Milgram in the 1960s. It began with participants believing they were helping in a learning experiment by delivering electric shocks to another person. What they didn't know was that the shocks weren't real, but their reactions were, and they revealed something chilling about human nature. Each time the learner answered incorrectly, participants were told to increase the voltage. As the shocks supposedly intensified, the learner screamed, begged, and eventually fell silent. Yet the authority figure in the lab coat calmly insisted, "Please continue." Most people believed only monsters could inflict suffering on the innocent, but Milgram discovered something far more terrifying. Regular, kind, everyday individuals continued pressing the switch, even when their hands shook and their voices trembled. They weren't driven by hatred or cruelty, but by a deep-rooted instinct to obey. The study exposes how authority can override conscience, how easily responsibility can be handed off to someone else, and how terrifyingly simple it is for people to justify harm when they feel they're just following orders. Participants later described feeling trapped, torn between compassion and compliance, yet still choosing obedience. The experiment forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The line between moral and immoral behavior is far thinner than we want to believe. Under the right pressure, people can abandon their values, silence their intuition, and become instruments of harm, all because someone in a position of power told them to. Asch Conformity Experiments. The Asch Conformity Experiments reveal a deeply unsettling truth about human behavior. People will often abandon what they know is true simply to fit in with the group. Solomon Asch's study seemed almost too simple. Participants were shown a line and asked which of 3 comparison lines matched its length. The answer was painfully obvious, yet when actors in the room, pretending to be ordinary participants, confidently chose the wrong line, something surprising happened. The real participants, even while visibly confused or uncomfortable, began agreeing with the obviously incorrect answers. They doubted their own eyes, their own logic, their own reality, because the pressure of standing alone felt heavier than the discomfort of being wrong. This experiment revealed a powerful psychological force that silently shapes our decisions every day: the fear of isolation. Humans are wired for belonging, and that need can override truth, identity, and even self-preservation. In Asch's study, people later admitted they knew the group was wrong, yet the thought of being the odd one out was enough to silence their honesty. That's what makes this experiment so mind-bending. It exposes how fragile our independence becomes in the presence of a unanimous group. Even when the stakes are low, conformity presses in like a psychological weight, pushing individuals to trade authenticity for acceptance. It shows how rumors spread, how bad decisions gain momentum, and how crowds can influence thoughts with nothing more than shared confidence. The Asch experiments warn us that group pressure doesn't always appear as bullying or coercion. Sometimes it shows up as a room full of people confidently choosing the wrong answer, leaving you to wonder if you're the one who's losing your grip on reality. Little Albert Conditioning Study. The Little Albert Conditioning Study is one of the most haunting demonstrations of how fear can be created, shaped, and embedded deep within the human mind. Conducted by John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner. In 1920, the experiment began with an innocent baby known as Albert, a child who initially showed no fear of animals. But Watson wanted to prove that emotions, especially fear, could be conditioned the same way we train habits or behaviors. So he introduced Albert to a white rat, letting him touch it, play with it, and smile at it. Then, without warning, Watson struck a steel bar with a hammer behind the baby's head, producing a sudden, terrifying noise. The sound startled Albert, making him cry. This pairing was repeated until something disturbing happened. Albert began to fear the rat, even when no noise followed. The fear had taken root. Soon, the terror spread. Albert started crying at the sight of a rabbit, a dog, even a man with a white beard. His mind had linked these harmless things to the threat of pain, proving just how easily fear can generalize and grow beyond its original source. What makes the study so emotionally jarring is how clearly it exposes the vulnerability of the human mind, especially in its earliest stages. It shows that fear is not always born from real danger. Sometimes it's planted quietly and deliberately by experiences we don't understand. Little Albert reminds us that many of the anxieties people carry into adulthood may have been shaped long before they had the words to describe them. It reveals how fragile trust can be, how quickly comfort can transform into fear, and how deeply the echoes of early experiences can follow us through life without us ever realizing why. Bobo Doll Aggression Experiment. The Bobo Doll Aggression Experiment is a striking reminder of how effortlessly human behavior, especially violence, can be learned simply by watching others. Conducted by Albert Bandura in the early 1960s, the study placed children in a room where an adult aggressively attacked a large inflatable Bobo doll, punching it, kicking it, and yelling at it with exaggerated force. The children watch, silent and observant, absorbing every movement and every burst of aggression. Later, when placed alone with the same doll, something unsettling happened. They copied the adult's violent behavior almost perfectly. Some even went further, inventing new ways to attack the doll, as if the aggression had awakened something dormant inside them. Bandura's study shattered the comforting belief that violence must be taught through direct punishment or reward. Instead, it revealed a sobering truth. People, especially children, learn by imitation long before they learn through consequences. They don't need to be encouraged to act aggressively. Just seeing aggression is enough to plant the seeds. What makes this experiment so emotionally striking is how clearly it exposes the influence of role models, media, and environment on shaping who we become. A single demonstration of violence can echo in the mind like a quiet command, urging behavior long after the moment has passed. The experiment forces us to confront how much of our personality is molded by the actions we witness and how easily destructive behavior can spread without anyone saying a word. It emphasizes the silent power of observation, reminding us that eyes are always watching, minds are always absorbing, and the behaviors we display, intentional or not, can become the blueprint for someone else's actions. The False Memory Implantation Study. The False Memory Implantation Study is one of the most disturbing proofs that the human mind can be rewritten without us ever noticing the edit. Conducted by Elizabeth Loftus, the experiment set out to show just how easy it is to plant a memory that never actually happened. Participants were told stories from their childhood, some real and one completely fabricated, such as getting lost in a shopping mall as a child. What's chilling is how quickly these invented memories took root. People didn't just accept the false event as true, they began adding vivid details, emotions, and sensations as if their mind were desperate to fill in the gaps with something that felt real. Loftus revealed a terrifying truth. Memory is not a recording, it's a reconstruction, fragile and malleable. Every time we recall something, we risk rewriting it, reshaping it, or contaminating it with new information. The study showed how easily suggestion, repetition, or emotion can twist recollections into something entirely different from what happened. What makes this experiment mind-blowing is that participants didn't suspect anything. They fully believed the implanted memory was part of their past, even insisting they could see it happening. The brain accepted fiction as truth because it felt familiar, emotionally charged, and confidently presented. This discovery has profound implications, especially in the courtroom, therapy, and everyday relationships. It suggests that the stories we cling to about who we are, what we've experienced, and what has shaped us may not be as solid as we think. The mind can betray us, not with lies meant to deceive others, but with illusions meant to comfort, protect, or simply make sense of the chaos of memory. Harlow's Monkey Attachment Study. Harlow's Monkey Attachment Study is one of the most heartbreaking and revealing experiments ever conducted, exposing the raw, desperate need for love that lives at the core of every human being. In the 1950s, Harry Harlow separated infant rhesus monkeys from their mothers and placed them with two artificial mothers, one made of cold wire that provided milk and another covered in soft cloth that offered no food at all. Logic would suggest the babies would cling to the wire mother, the one that kept them alive. But what happened instead was profoundly moving and painfully illuminating. The infants clung to the cloth mother for hours, buried their faces in her softness, and ran to her whenever they felt frightened. They only approached the wire mother long enough to feed, then immediately returned to the warmth they craved. This simple, heartbreaking preference shattered the belief that children bond with caregivers solely because they provide food. It revealed a deeper truth. Emotional security, comfort, and physical closeness are psychological lifelines. When the monkeys were frightened by loud noises or strange objects, they didn't seek food, they sought comfort. And without it, they became anxious, withdrawn, and unable to form healthy relationships later in life. The study exposes the devastating consequences of emotional neglect. Harlow's monkeys raised without love grew into adults who rocked compulsively, avoided others, and struggled to connect, mirroring the wounds seen in neglected humans. What makes this experiment so mind-blowing is how clearly it proves that affection isn't a luxury, it's a biological necessity. It shows that touch shapes the brain, comfort shapes the heart, and the absence of love leaves marks far deeper than hunger ever could. Rosenhan's Being Sane in Insane Places. Rosenhan's Being sane in insane places is one of the most unsettling psychological experiments ever conducted because it exposes how fragile the boundary is between sanity and madness when judged by authority. In the early 1970s, David Rosenhan sent 8 perfectly healthy individuals, including himself, into psychiatric hospitals across the country. Their only fabricated symptom was a single word they claimed to hear: thud. Everything else about them, their history, their behavior, their personalities, was completely normal. Yet once admitted, something chilling happened. Staff labeled them as schizophrenic, and no matter how rationally they behaved afterward, the label stuck like a permanent stain. Every gesture, every question, even their calmness, was interpreted as a symptom of their supposed illness. They were treated as if their identity had been erased, replaced by a diagnosis that distorted everything they did. Nurses spoke about them as though they were invisible. Doctors ignored their explanations. Some patients begged to be understood, yet were dismissed as hallucinating. The illusion of madness had become more real than their actual sanity. What makes this experiment so mind-blowing is how brutally it reveals the power of labels to shape perception. Once someone is deemed insane, the world stops listening to who they are and starts seeing only who it expects them to be. Rosenhan's work forces us to confront the terrifying possibility that sanity is not always recognized by truth, but often by expectation, authority, and bias. It shows how institutions meant to heal can inadvertently dehumanize, how misunderstood people can be trapped inside identities imposed on them, and how easily a system can turn reality into a prison where no amount of reason is enough to set you free. The Marshmallow Delay of Gratification Test. The Marshmallow Test is one of the most revealing and emotionally charged experiments ever conducted on human self-control because it exposes the quiet battles taking place inside every mind, even a child's. In the late 1960s, Walter Mischel invited young children into a room, placed a marshmallow in front of them, and offered a simple deal. They could eat it now or wait alone for several minutes and receive 2 marshmallows instead. What happened next was a raw display of inner struggle. Children squirmed, hummed, kicked their feet, covered their eyes, or tried to distract themselves as temptation whispered to them louder than reason ever could. Some resisted with heroic determination, while others gave in almost instantly, overwhelmed by the sweetness sitting inches away. What makes this experiment so mind-blowing is not just the adorable innocence of the moment, but the staggering long-term implications that followed. Years later, the children who managed to wait often showed better emotional regulation, stronger academic performance, and greater resilience. Their ability to delay gratification wasn't just about marshmallows. It was a window into how they handled desire, frustration, and self-discipline in the real world. The ones who struggled weren't weak. They simply revealed how powerful immediate reward can be when the future feels uncertain or intangible. The test exposes a delicate psychological truth. The human mind is constantly torn between what feels good now and what could change everything later. It reveals how early habits of patience or impulsivity can shape the trajectory of a life, not through fate, but through tiny repeated choices. Watching those children wrestle with temptation shows how deeply our future selves depend on the quiet decisions we make when no one else is watching. The Good Samaritan Experiment. The Good Samaritan Experiment is a striking reminder of how compassion can be shaped, controlled, and even silenced by something as simple as time. Conducted by John Darley and Daniel Batson, the study observed seminary students, people training to devote their lives to helping others, as they were asked to give a talk in a nearby building. Some were told they had plenty of time, others that they were running late. Along the walkway, the researchers placed a man slumped over, coughing and groaning in obvious distress. You would expect future ministers to stop without hesitation, yet what happened was unsettling. Those who believed they were late almost always kept walking, stepping over or around the suffering stranger as if he were invisible. Their urgency swallowed their empathy. Their schedule drowned out their moral duty. The study revealed a painful truth about human nature. Our goodness is not just a reflection of our character, but also of our circumstances. Even the kindest, most well-intentioned people can become blind to someone's pain when pressure closes in around them. What makes this experiment so emotionally jarring is the realization that compassion can be overridden not by cruelty, but by hurry. These students weren't heartless. They were trapped in the belief that being late to something important justified ignoring someone in need. It showed how easily we silence our conscience when our mind is racing, how often we convince ourselves that someone else will help, and how quickly urgency can erode humanity. The Good Samaritan experiment forces us to confront the unsettling possibility that many moments of suffering in the world go unanswered, not because people don't care, but because they're too caught up in their own rush to even notice the person hurting right in front of them. The Invisible Gorilla Selective Attention Test. The Invisible Gorilla experiment is one of the most astonishing reminders of how easily the human mind can miss the obvious when it's focused on something else. Created by Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris, the study asked participants to watch a short video of people passing basketballs and count the passes of one specific team. It sounded simple, almost boring, until something unbelievable happened. In the middle of the video, a person in a full gorilla suit calmly walked into the scene, stopped, pounded their chest, and walked out again. You would think no one could possibly miss something that bizarre, yet nearly half of the viewers never saw it. They watched the whole video with full attention, their eyes open, their brains engaged, and still the gorilla vanished from their awareness as if it had never existed. This experiment reveals a shocking truth. Attention is not the same as perception. When the mind locks onto a task, it filters reality with ruthless precision, allowing only what it deems relevant to enter awareness. Everything else, no matter how obvious or absurd, can become invisible. The result is unsettling because it exposes the fragility of our assumptions about awareness. We believe we're observant. We believe we notice what matters, but the invisible gorilla proves that even major, undeniable events can slip right past our consciousness when our focus narrows. This isn't just a psychological trick. It's a window into how people miss red flags in relationships, overlook danger, and fail to see opportunities right in front of them. The world doesn't hide things from us. Our own attention does. The experiment forces us to question not just what we see, but everything we confidently assume we're not missing. Learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is one of the most emotionally disturbing psychological discoveries because it reveals how easily the human mind can be trained to stop fighting for its own freedom, even when escape is possible. In the late 1960s, Martin Seligman conducted an experiment that began with dogs placed in a situation where they received unpredictable, inescapable shocks. At first, they tried everything, jumping, running, struggling, to stop the pain, but no matter what they did, nothing changed. Eventually, something heartbreaking happened. They stopped trying. They simply lay down, whimpering, accepting the suffering as their fate. Later, when those same dogs were placed in a new environment where escape was easy, just a small jump away, they didn't even attempt it. The door was open, the path was clear, but their minds had been sealed shut. They had learned to believe their actions didn't matter. This phenomenon doesn't just happen to animals, it happens to people every day. Individuals stuck in toxic relationships, hostile workplaces, or cycles of failure can begin to internalize the belief that nothing they do will make a difference. They stop resisting, stop hoping, and stop reaching for the freedom right in front of them. That's what makes this experiment so emotionally powerful. It shows the psychological chains that can form when someone is pushed repeatedly into situations they cannot control. Once the mind accepts powerlessness, even opportunities for escape feel invisible. Learned helplessness exposes the tragic truth that people can become prisoners, not of circumstances, but of their own shattered expectations, carrying a kind of silent suffering that convinces them change is impossible, even when it's only one step away. The Rat Park Addiction Experiment. The Rat Park Experiment is one of the most groundbreaking and emotionally stirring challenges to everything we thought we knew about addiction. Conducted by Bruce Alexander in the late 1970s, it started with a simple question: what if addiction isn't caused by the drug itself, but by the environment surrounding the individual? Previous studies had shown rats relentlessly pressing levers for morphine-laced water, often choosing it over food until they died. It painted a grim picture that chemicals alone could hijack the brain and destroy the will to live. But Alexander saw something missing. Those rats were isolated, trapped in empty cages with nothing but loneliness and a drug dispenser. So he built Rat Park, a spacious, colorful environment filled with toys, tunnels, social interaction, and freedom. When rats lived in this enriched world, something astonishing happened. Even when given access to the same powerful drug, they barely touched it. They drank regular water instead, played, bonded, and thrived. But when rats were placed back into isolation, addiction surged again. The experiment delivered a powerful, emotionally charged revelation. Suffering, loneliness, and lack of purpose were stronger predictors of addiction than any chemical substance. The drug wasn't the escape, they were escaping the cage. This study forces us to confront a painfully human truth. People don't fall into addiction because they're weak, broken, or destined for destruction. They fall because something in their world feels empty, unbearable, or disconnected. Rat Park showed that when beings, rat or human, have connection, joy, support, and meaning, the pull of addictive behavior fades like a shadow exposed to light. It revealed that the real prison isn't the drug, it's the life someone is trying to numb. The False Consensus Effect Experiment. The False Consensus Effect Experiment exposes a deeply uncomfortable truth about the human mind. We believe our thoughts, preferences, and behaviors are far more common than they actually are. Psychologists Lee Ross, David Green, and Pamela House demonstrated this by asking participants simple questions: what they would do in a given situation, what opinions they held, what choices they preferred, and then asking them to estimate how many others would make the same decision. No matter the topic, people consistently assumed that others saw the world just as they did. What makes this experiment so mind-bending is not the bias itself, but what it reveals about the fragile way our reality is constructed. We don't just hold beliefs, we wrap our identity around them. And to protect that identity, the mind convinces us that our view is the normal one, the rational one, the one most people surely agree with. This illusion creates a psychological comfort zone, shielding us from the isolation of believing something unpopular. Yet this comfort is dangerous because it distorts how we understand relationships, conflicts, and even society itself. The experiment showed that when people thought others agreed with them, they felt validated and confident. But when they imagined disagreement, they dismissed those who differed as uninformed, irrational, or biased. It revealed how quickly we create an us versus them mentality without ever realizing we're doing it. What hits hardest is realizing how often this bias silently guides our assumptions about politics, morality, friendships, love, and every emotional battle we fight. The false consensus effect warns us that much of our certainty isn't truth. It's a psychological echo chamber built inside our own mind, persuading us that the world mirrors us far more than it actually does. The Halo Effect Experiment. The Halo Effect Experiment is one of the most unsettling demonstrations of how easily our minds can be manipulated by appearances, revealing how a single positive trait can distort everything we think we know about a person. Psychologist Edward Thorndike first uncovered this phenomenon when he noticed military officers consistently rating their soldiers as either entirely good or entirely bad based on just one trait, usually physical appearance or demeanor. If a soldier looked sharp and confident, he was judged as more intelligent, more disciplined, more trustworthy. If he appeared sloppy or awkward, every other rating plummeted with it. What makes this experiment so mind-bending is how effortlessly the brain creates a full personality out of one superficial detail. When we see someone attractive, well-spoken, or charming, our minds instantly build an entire story around them. We project kindness, competence, and good intentions onto them without a single shred of evidence. It happens automatically, silently, and powerfully. The halo effect reveals how often we fall in love with illusions. Teachers grade more favorably when they like a student's face. Judges punish attractive defendants less harshly. Strangers trust a pleasant smile faster than a solid argument. Even in everyday life, someone who looks put together can walk into a room and receive warmth, trust, and opportunity long before they've proven anything. The darker side of this finding is how brutally it shapes people's fate. Those who don't fit society's ideal image are judged more harshly, dismissed more quickly, and misunderstood more easily, not because of who they are, but because of a snap judgment made in seconds. The halo effect exposes how dangerously flawed our perception can be, showing that sometimes we're not responding to the person in front of us at all. We're responding to the story our mind creates the moment we see them. The Robbers Cave Intergroup Conflict Study. The Robbers Cave Intergroup Conflict Study is a striking demonstration of how easily division, hostility, and even hatred can be manufactured between perfectly ordinary people. Conducted by Muzaffar Sharif in 1954, the experiment took place at a summer camp where two groups of boys, unaware of each other at first, bonded within their own teams, forming friendships, routines, and a sense of identity. But when the researchers finally introduced the groups to one another, something powerful and unsettling unfolded. The boys, once just kids eager for adventure, began slipping into us versus them, thinking with almost frightening speed. Simple competitions ignited fierce rivalries. Games turned into battles, name-calling escalated into vandalism, and hostility spread like wildfire. Flags were torn down, cabins raided, and the boys grew so consumed by tribal loyalty that reason seemed to vanish. Their identities became entangled with their group, and the other side transformed from strangers into enemies. What makes this experiment so emotionally gripping is how it reveals a dark, instinctive part of human nature, the longing to belong, and the dangerous edge that belonging carries. The boys weren't taught to hate. They discovered it through competition, scarcity, and the intoxicating power of shared identity. Yet something even more astonishing followed. When the researchers introduced challenges that required cooperation, fixing a broken water supply, pulling a stalled truck, the hatred began to dissolve. Working side by side, the boys slowly rediscovered each other's humanity. The Robbers Cave study exposes just how fragile peace can be and how easily conflict can erupt from nothing more than divided groups and competing goals. But it also shows that unity is not impossible. It simply demands a shared purpose strong enough to shatter the walls we build between us. The Genovese Bystander Effect Study. The Genovese Bystander Effect Study is one of the most heartbreaking and psychologically revealing events ever examined because it exposes the chilling silence that can rise when responsibility is shared among strangers. In 1964, Kitty Genovese was attacked outside her New York apartment building. Reports later claimed dozens of neighbors heard or saw parts of the assault, yet almost no one intervened. People froze, hesitated, or assumed someone else would help. This tragedy shook the world and drove psychologists Bibb Latané and John Darley to investigate why so many could stand by while another human begged for help. Their experiments placed participants in staged emergencies, smoke filling a room, someone collapsing, cries for assistance, and the results were painfully clear. When people were alone, they acted quickly, but when others were present, action plummeted. Individuals looked around, saw others staying quiet, and interpreted that silence as a signal to remain passive. Responsibility didn't multiply in a crowd, it dissolved. What makes this phenomenon so emotionally jarring is how deeply it contradicts our belief in human courage. We imagine we'd rush in, shout for help, break the pattern, yet the bystander effect shows how fear, uncertainty, and social cues can override instinct and conscience. People don't fail to help because they don't care. They freeze because everyone else freezes. They wait for someone braver, someone certain, someone in charge. But when everyone waits, no one moves. The study forces us to face an unsettling truth about human behavior. Danger doesn't only test our bravery, it tests our independence from the crowd. It reveals how easily compassion can be muted by hesitation, how quickly urgency can be swallowed by silence, and how a single moment of inaction can echo far beyond the instant it occurs. The monster study. The monster study is one of the most unsettling experiments ever conducted on children, revealing how fragile the human psyche is and how easily a single voice of criticism can warp a developing sense of self. In 1939, Wendell Johnson and Mary Tudor set out to explore the roots of stuttering by dividing a group of orphans into two categories. Some children were praised for their speech, encouraged gently, and told they were doing well. The others, children who had no speech problems at all, were subjected to harsh, relentless criticism. They were told their speech was flawed, that they were beginning to stutter, that they needed to watch every word they said. It didn't take long before something heartbreaking happened. Perfectly fluent children began hesitating, shutting down, avoiding speech, and drowning in anxiety. Words that once came freely now felt dangerous. Their voices cracked, not from a physical disorder, but from the crushing weight of self-doubt planted in their minds. What makes this experiment so emotionally devastating is how clearly it shows that a child's identity can be reshaped by the beliefs forced onto them. These children didn't stutter because something was wrong with them. They stuttered because they were convinced something was wrong with them. The monster study exposes the terrifying power of suggestion, especially when delivered by authority. It proves that criticism can carve deep scars, that shame can silence even the strongest spirit, and that the echoes of a few harmful words can linger for a lifetime. It forces us to face the painful truth that confidence is fragile, and the voices children hear, positive or destructive, can forever determine how loudly they learn to speak in the world. The Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes Classroom Experiment. The Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes experiment is one of the most emotionally jarring demonstrations of how easily prejudice can be created, accepted, and acted upon, even among innocent children. Conducted by teacher Jane Elliott, the day after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, she wanted her third-grade students to understand the brutality of discrimination, not through a lecture, but through experience, so she divided the class by eye color. On the first day, she declared that blue-eyed children were superior. They were smarter, cleaner, and more deserving. Brown-eyed children were told they were lazy, messy, and less intelligent. With nothing but her words, the classroom transformed instantly. Children who had been close friends turned cold. Blue-eyed kids began to taunt and exclude their brown-eyed classmates, speaking down to them with confidence and entitlement they had never shown before. Brown-eyed children shrank into themselves, performing worse on tasks they'd easily mastered the day before. Their shoulders slumped, their voices softened, and their belief in their own ability seemed to evaporate in hours. The next day, Elliot reversed the roles. Suddenly, the blue-eyed children felt the sting of discrimination they had so casually inflicted, and the brown-eyed children felt the intoxicating rush of unearned superiority. The emotions were raw: shame, anger, confusion, and guilt tangled together as the children realized how effortlessly they had accepted the labels assigned to them. What makes this experiment so mind-blowing is how brutally it exposes the mechanics of prejudice. Nothing had changed except a story, a single statement of who was better, yet it reshaped identity, behavior, and morality within minutes. It reveals how discrimination isn't born from facts but from authority, expectation, and the human craving to belong, even at someone else's expense. The Violent Media Desensitization Study. The Violent Media Desensitization Study reveals a chilling truth about the human mind. Repeated exposure to violence can quietly numb our emotional responses, shifting our sense of empathy without us even noticing. Researchers showed participants violent films, video game footage, and disturbing imagery over time, measuring their physiological and emotional reactions. At first, their bodies reacted intensely: faster heartbeats, heightened tension, clear discomfort. But as the exposure continued, something unsettling began to happen. Their reactions weakened. Their emotional alarm systems grew quieter. Scenes that once made them flinch or look away no longer stirred the same instinctive shock. People who initially felt horror began watching with an eerie calmness, as though the violence had lost its meaning. What makes this study so mind-bending is the realization that desensitization doesn't announce itself. It slips in slowly, silently, reshaping how we perceive pain, suffering, and fear. When the participants later witnessed real-world aggression, two people arguing, someone being shoved, they showed significantly less empathy and slower responses to intervene. Their minds had been conditioned to treat violence as normal, almost expected, as if their emotional defenses had been rewired. The study exposes the terrifying possibility that constant exposure to violent entertainment doesn't just change how we feel about media, it changes how we feel about people. It reveals how the brain adapts to repeated images of harm by dulling the very sensitivity that makes us human. The desensitization effect extends far beyond the lab. It echoes in how we scroll past disturbing videos without pausing, how shocking headlines lose their impact, and how real pain becomes just another piece of content. The Violent Media Desensitization Study forces us to confront the hidden cost of our overstimulated world, the quiet erosion of empathy, one violent image at a time. The Cognitive Dissonance Peg-Turning Experiment. The Cognitive Dissonance Peg-Turning Experiment is one of the most unsettling demonstrations of how the mind twists reality just to protect our sense of self, conducted by Leon Festinger and Merrill Carl-Smith. In 1959, the study began with an intentionally boring task. Participants spent an hour turning wooden pegs on a board over and over, doing meaningless motions that drained their energy and patience. After this tedious ordeal, they were asked to do something strange, convince another participant that the task was actually enjoyable. Some were paid $20 for this lie, while others received only $1. It should have been simple. The bigger reward should have led to greater justification, but the results exposed something far more disturbing about how the mind handles internal conflict. The participants who were paid $20 knew they were lying and felt no need to change their beliefs, but the ones who received just $1 felt uneasy, almost guilty, because the tiny reward wasn't enough to justify their dishonesty. To ease that discomfort, they unconsciously changed their attitudes, convincing themselves that the peg turning had actually been interesting. Their minds rewrote reality just to make the lie feel less like a betrayal, of their own values. What makes this experiment so emotionally powerful is how clearly it exposes the quiet war inside the human mind. We rewrite memories, justify choices, and reshape beliefs not because they're true, but because the alternative feels too painful to confront. Cognitive dissonance reveals that people don't simply seek truth. They seek psychological comfort. It shows how easily the mind bends under the strain of contradiction, how quickly discomfort becomes distortion, and how often we lie to ourselves just to keep believing we are who we want to be. The Phantom Limb Mirror Box Experiment. The Phantom Limb Mirror Box Experiment is one of the most extraordinary demonstrations of how the mind can rewrite the body's reality and how pain can be trapped, not in flesh, but in perception. Developed by neuroscientist V.S. Ramachandran, the experiment focused on amputees who continued to feel their missing limbs as if they were still attached. Some felt itching they couldn't scratch. Others endured unbearable cramps in hands that no longer existed. Their bodies were whole, but their brains refused to update the map of themselves. Ramachandran created a simple box with a mirror down the middle, allowing patients to place their intact limb on one side while the reflection appeared where the missing limb should be. When they looked into the mirror, it created a powerful illusion. The phantom limb suddenly reappeared, moving in perfect synchronization with the real one. For many, the moment was overwhelming. Their missing hand seemed to unclench after years of painful cramping, as if the brain finally released a tension it had been gripping since the amputation. Some cried, not from pain, but from the shock of feeling relief in a limb that technically no longer existed. What makes this experiment so emotionally staggering is how clearly it reveals the mind's capacity to imprison us in sensations that aren't real and to free us with illusions that are. The brain clings to familiar patterns, even when the body changes, proving that suffering can persist simply because the mind hasn't learned to let go. The mirror box showed that perception isn't passive. It shapes our reality, our pain, and our healing, reminding us that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not in the body, but in the maps our brain refuses to rewrite. The IKEA Effect Experiment. The IKEA Effect Experiment is one of the most fascinating insights into the human mind, revealing how deeply we overvalue the things we help create, even when what we create is simple, flawed, or objectively unimpressive. Researchers Michael Norton, Daniel Moshon, and Dan Ariely discovered this phenomenon when they asked participants to assemble basic IKEA furniture, fold origami figures, or build simple crafts. What happened next was astonishing. People valued their own creations far higher than identical items built by someone else, even when their versions were crooked, uneven, or poorly constructed. The act of building something, even badly, triggered a sense of ownership so powerful that it blinded them to the object's flaws. This experiment exposes a raw truth about human psychology. Effort creates emotional attachment. When we pour time, energy, or frustration into something, our brains rewrite its worth, convincing us it's special simply because it has a piece of us in it. This bias isn't limited to furniture. It shows up in relationships we fight to maintain long after they've stopped serving us, in projects we refuse to abandon even when they drain us, and in beliefs we cling to because we've invested years defending them. The IKEA Effect reveals why people stay loyal to things that hurt them, why they defend ideas that no longer make sense, and why letting go feels like losing a part of themselves. The mind confuses effort with value. It convinces us that struggle makes something meaningful, even when the meaning exists only in our perception. This experiment forces us to confront how easily our emotions can distort judgment, turning sweat into sentiment and labor into love, leaving us wondering whether we truly cherish something or simply the effort we poured into it. The Spotlight Effect Experiment. The Spotlight Effect Experiment reveals a truth that feels both comforting and heartbreaking. We go through life believing people are constantly noticing our mistakes, our flaws, our awkward moments, when in reality, they rarely are. Thomas Gilovich and his colleagues demonstrated this by asking participants to wear a bright, embarrassing t-shirt, convince everyone around them would stare, judge, and whisper. But when the researchers asked observers later, almost no one had even noticed. What felt like a spotlight glaring down on the participant was nothing more than a dim flicker in other people's minds. This experiment exposes the painful illusion we live under, the belief that our imperfections are magnified for the world to see, when the truth is that most people are far too consumed with their own insecurities to focus on ours. What makes this study so emotionally striking is how deeply it reflects everyday experience. We replay moments where we tripped over words, mispronounced something, spilled a drink, or said the wrong thing, convinced the memory is burned into everyone's mind. But the spotlight effect shows that while we are busy obsessing over how we appeared, others are quietly focused on themselves, trapped in their own imagined spotlights. This experiment peels back the layers of social fear and reveals a tender reality. The judgment we dread is largely imagined, built from our own anxieties rather than anyone else's attention. It forces us to confront how much of our life is shaped by the fear of being seen too clearly. Yet the study also offers a quiet kind of freedom. If the world isn't watching as closely as we think, then the moments we fear most lose their power. The spotlight exists, but only in our minds. And once we understand that, the weight of being constantly observed begins to fade. The Stanford Hypnosis Susceptibility Study. The Stanford Hypnosis Susceptibility Study is one of the most mesmerizing explorations into how deeply the human mind can be influenced when the conscious guard drops and the subconscious rises to the surface. Conducted by Ernest Hilgard and his team at Stanford, the study set out to measure how easily people could slip into hypnotic states, those strange mental spaces where imagination begins to feel like reality. Participants were guided through hypnotic suggestions and then asked to perform tasks that blurred the line between control and surrender, feeling their arm grow weightless, imagining intense sensations, forgetting simple information, or even becoming numb to pain. What emerged was astonishing. Some individuals resisted every suggestion, staying anchored in full awareness, but others, about a tenth of the population, entered such deep hypnotic states that their responses transformed dramatically, as if a hidden switch inside their mind had been flipped. They followed suggestions with complete conviction, not because they were weak or gullible, but because their subconscious responded with vivid intensity far beyond their conscious intention. What makes this study so emotionally captivating is how it reveals the secret landscapes within the mind, places where belief becomes sensation, where imagination becomes experience, where the boundary between voluntary and involuntary blurs. It shows that the mind is not a single unified force, but a layered system, full of doors that can be opened with the right key. Some people discovered they could block out pain, let memories fade, or experience illusions as if they were real. Others felt a strange detachment, as if watching themselves from a distance. The Stanford study exposes how powerful suggestion can become when it slips beneath the surface, revealing a mind far more malleable, mysterious, and responsive than most people ever dare to believe. The rubber hand illusion. The rubber hand illusion is one of the most mind-bending demonstrations of how easily the brain can be tricked into believing a lie about the body it controls. In this experiment, participants place their real hand out of sight while a lifelike rubber hand is positioned in front of them. A researcher then strokes both the hidden real hand and the visible fake hand at the same time. Within moments, something astonishing happens. the brain begins to adopt the rubber hand as its own. Participants report tingling sensations in the fake hand, a strange sense of ownership, and an eerie feeling that their body has expanded into something that isn't even alive. When the researcher suddenly threatens the rubber hand, people flinch, gasp, or jerk back in fear, as if their very flesh were in danger. What makes this experiment emotionally gripping is not just the illusion itself, but what it reveals about the fragility of our self-awareness. The brain doesn't wait for logic. It grabs on to whatever sensory evidence feels consistent, even if it means rewriting your sense of identity. The line between me and not me becomes disturbingly thin. The rubber hand illusion exposes how easily our body map, something we think of as fixed and absolute, can be hacked by simple, synchronized touches. It suggests that the sense of embodied self, the feeling of being rooted in your own skin, is not as anchored or permanent as we imagine. The experiment forces us to confront the unsettling truth that our sense of self is negotiable, that the brain will cling to illusions if they feel real enough, and that even the boundaries of our own body can dissolve under the right conditions, leaving us questioning how much of our identity is truly ours at all. The Jam Choice Overload Experiment. The Jam Choice Overload Experiment is one of the most startling illustrations of how too many options can paralyze the human mind, leaving us overwhelmed, dissatisfied, and unable to choose, even when the choices are harmless. Psychologists Sheena Iyengar and Mark Lepper set up a simple tasting booth at a grocery store. On some days, shoppers were offered 6 flavors of jam. On others, they were offered 24. Logic suggests that more options would excite shoppers, drawing them in and increasing sales. But what happened was the opposite. The table with 24 jars attracted far more people, yet almost no one bought anything. The smaller display, with only 6 choices, led to 10 times more purchases. The reason is deeply psychological. When people saw the large assortment, their minds lit up with curiosity, but quickly collapsed under the weight of comparison. Every choice came with the fear of missing out on a better one, the pressure to make the perfect decision, and the anxiety of imagining regret. The brain became tangled in possibility, frozen by the fear of choosing wrong. What makes this experiment so emotionally gripping is how painfully familiar it feels. People experience the same paralysis when scrolling through endless movies, dating apps, job choices, or life paths. The overload doesn't inspire freedom. It creates doubt, stress, and a lingering sense of dissatisfaction with whatever choice is finally made. The Jam experiment reveals a haunting truth. More options don't make us happier. They often make us feel lost. It shows how abundance can quietly transform into anxiety, how possibility can turn into pressure, and how the freedom to choose can become the very thing that traps us. The Broken Windows Theory Field Study. The Broken Windows Theory Field Study uncovered a startling truth about human behavior. Small signs of disorder don't just reflect chaos. They invited researchers conducted real-world tests by subtly altering environments, leaving a single broken window, scattered litter, or graffiti in areas that were normally orderly. What followed was a ripple effect that grew faster and darker than anyone expected. People walking by began acting differently. They were more likely to litter where litter already existed, more likely to trespass where a fence was slightly damaged, and more likely to steal when they sensed the environment was already slipping into neglect. A single crack in the system seemed to whisper permission. What makes this study so psychologically gripping is how quietly the transformation happens. No one is told to behave badly, yet they do. Disorder creates a kind of unconscious emotional shift, a subtle message that no one cares, that rules are flexible, that consequences are unlikely. The environment begins shaping behavior in ways people don't even realize. When the researchers left a single broken window untouched, Soon more windows were smashed, as if chaos had been waiting for an excuse to surface. The study revealed how fragile social order truly is, how easily respect for rules dissolves when surroundings signal indifference. But the most haunting part is how this extends beyond neighborhoods and into the human mind. A messy environment can create a messy conscience. When people feel unseen or unprotected, their moral boundaries weaken. When the world around them looks abandoned, they begin abandoning parts of themselves. The Broken Windows Field study shows that disorder isn't just physical, it's contagious. It spreads through behavior, and once it begins, it can transform ordinary people into contributors of the very chaos they once would have walked past in discomfort. The Framing Effect. Tversky and Kahneman Experiment. The Framing Effect Experiment by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman is one of the most mind-bending revelations about how easily our decisions can be shaped, not by facts, but by the way those facts are presented. In their study, participants were given choices about a life or death scenario involving a deadly disease. The options were mathematically identical, yet phrased differently. One set emphasized lives saved, the other emphasized lives lost. What happened was both shocking and deeply human. When the choices were framed positively, people rushed toward the safe option. But when the exact same outcomes were framed negatively, people suddenly became risk seekers, willing to gamble with lives simply because the wording triggered a different emotional response. This experiment exposes something unsettling about the human mind. We don't make decisions as rationally as we believe. The truth doesn't hit us directly. It filters through our emotions, our fears, and the subtle cues hidden in language. A few words can twist our perception, making danger feel safe or safety feel dangerous. Tversky and Kahneman revealed that our judgments are fragile, swayed not by logic, but by the emotional shadows cast by phrasing. What makes this study so emotionally gripping is how silently this distortion happens. People didn't realize the decisions they made were being nudged by wording. They felt certain, confident, justified, yet their certainty was an illusion built by framing. It shows how easily advertising, politics, media, and even personal conversations can steer our choices without us ever noticing. The experiment forces us to confront a deeper truth. The stories we're told don't just inform us, they shape the very decisions we believe are our own. The Stereotype Threat Performance Study. The Stereotype Threat Performance Study is a powerful and unsettling reminder of how deeply our beliefs and the beliefs others place on us can shape our abilities in ways we don't even realize. Conducted by Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson, the experiment revealed that when individuals are reminded of a negative stereotype about their group right before performing a task, their performance can drop dramatically. Students who were fully capable, intelligent, and prepared suddenly struggled simply because a seed of doubt was planted in their minds. A simple reminder, one quiet implication that people like you don't do well at this, was enough to drain confidence, tighten anxiety, and make their minds sabotage themselves. What makes this study so emotionally piercing is that the participants weren't failing because they lacked ability. They failed because they felt watched, judged, and burdened by expectations that didn't belong to them. Their heartbeat quickened, their focus fractured, and a silent pressure wrapped around them like a weight they couldn't shake. The fear of confirming a stereotype became the very thing that made them stumble. The experiment revealed something heartbreaking. The human mind doesn't just respond to the world around it. It responds to the stories society tells about who we're allowed to be. Stereotype Threat shows how invisible chains can restrain even the most capable individuals, how doubt can be inherited, and how people can feel their potential slipping away the moment they sense that their identity is under scrutiny. It exposes how easily brilliance can be dimmed, not by lack of talent, but by the quiet terror of being judged through a lens you never asked to wear, proving that the mind can become its own obstacle when fear whispers louder than ability. The Misattribution of Arousal Suspension Bridge Study. The Misattribution of Arousal Suspension Bridge Study is one of the most captivating demonstrations of how easily our emotions can be confused, misread, and redirected without us even realizing it. Conducted by psychologists Donald Dutton and Arthur Aaron, the experiment began with a simple setup, a high, shaky suspension bridge that swayed dangerously over a rocky canyon. Men crossing the bridge were approached by an attractive female researcher who asked them to fill out a questionnaire. She then casually offered her phone number, inviting them to call if they had any questions. What happened next was astonishing. The men who met her on the trembling bridge were far more likely to call her later, and their written responses showed noticeably higher levels of romantic and sexual attraction. The same interaction on a stable, safe bridge produced far less interest. The reason lies in a psychological trap. When our bodies feel heightened arousal, like a racing heart, sweaty palms, or shaky breathing, we instinctively search for an explanation. But the brain isn't great at identifying the source, so the fear, adrenaline, and excitement from the dangerous bridge were misinterpreted as attraction toward the woman. Their bodies screamed danger, but their minds translated it as desire. This experiment exposes a stunning truth about human emotion. We often don't understand what we feel or why we feel it. Our hearts react first, and our brains make up stories later. It explains why thrilling dates feel more romantic, why arguments can spark sudden passion, and why people fall for others during moments of chaos, fear, or intensity. The study reveals how easily arousal can hijack perception, turning danger into desire and confusion into connection without us ever realizing the mix-up. The Prisoner's Dilemma. Cooperation experiments. The Prisoner's Dilemma cooperation experiments reveal a powerful and unsettling truth about human relationships. Trust is fragile, fear is persuasive, and the temptation to protect oneself can destroy the very connection we hope to build. In the classic scenario, two individuals are separated and offered a choice: cooperate with each other for a mutual benefit or betray the other for a personal reward. The catch is devastatingly simple. If one betrays and the other remains loyal, the betrayer wins big while the loyal one suffers. If both betray, they both lose, and if both cooperate, they win together. Yet time and time again, people choose betrayal, even when cooperation is clearly the better path. What makes this experiment so emotionally gripping is how deeply it mirrors real life. People often want to trust, to work together, to act with integrity. But the fear of being taken advantage of looking foolish, vulnerable, or naive, pushes them towards self-preservation. The mind whispers, protect yourself first, even when that protection destroys the possibility of something better. In repeated versions of the dilemma, patterns emerge that are heartbreakingly human. Moments of cooperation shattered by sudden fear, alliances built through trust only to collapse under suspicion, cycles of betrayal that grow harder to break each round. The experiments show how quickly distrust spreads, how one act of self-protection can ignite a chain reaction of retaliation, and how difficult it is to rebuild cooperation once it's broken. Yet they also reveal something hopeful. When trust is nurtured, slowly, consistently, people begin choosing unity over fear. The Prisoner's Dilemma exposes the delicate emotional dance between vulnerability and safety, revealing how easily fear can sabotage connection and how desperately we crave a world where choosing trust doesn't feel like a risk. The Ultimatum Game Fairness Experiment. The Ultimatum Game Fairness Experiment is one of the most emotionally revealing windows into how deeply humans crave justice, even when it costs them. In this experiment, one participant was given money and told to split it with another person in any way they chose. The second person could either accept the offer or reject it. If they rejected it, neither person received anything. Logically, people should accept any amount, even a tiny fraction, because something is better than nothing. But that isn't what happened. When offers were unfair, insultingly low, dismissive, or greedy, the second person often chose to reject them, sacrificing their own reward just to punish the selfishness. It was an emotional stand, a refusal to be treated as less worthy, a burst of moral defiance that spoke louder than reason ever could. What makes this experiment so gripping is how clearly it exposes the human heart behind the human mind. People don't just want resources, they want respect. They don't just want to gain, they want dignity. When someone feels slighted, undervalued, or manipulated, the desire for fairness burns hotter than any financial incentive. The ultimatum game shows that humans would rather walk away empty-handed than accept a deal that tells them they don't matter. It reveals the fierce inner instinct that demands equality, the pain we feel when someone exploits us, and the powerful emotional justice system built into our psychology. This experiment uncovers a truth we often deny. Fairness isn't a luxury, it's a fundamental human need, one that can override logic, override profit, and override self-interest the moment someone senses they are being treated unjustly. The Deindividuation Hooded Children Study. The Deindividuation Hooded Children Study is one of the most chilling demonstrations of how anonymity can loosen the grip of conscience and awaken impulses we don't always recognize in ourselves. Conducted by Edward Diener and colleagues, the experiment observed children on Halloween to see how their behavior changed when their identities were concealed. Some children were asked for their names and told they were being watched. Others were left anonymous, hidden beneath their costumes with no sense of being individually recognized. When the researchers stepped out of the room and left a bowl of candy with clear instructions to take only one piece, something startling happened. The children who remained identifiable mostly obeyed, but those who were anonymous, especially when in groups, began grabbing handfuls of candy, acting with a boldness and disregard they never would have shown had their names or faces been known. What makes this study so emotionally gripping is how quickly the children's behavior shifted the moment their individuality dissolved. The anonymity didn't just free them from consequences, it freed them from themselves. It revealed how thin the veil of self-control can be when identity fades into the background. The hooded costumes, the group setting, the sense of invisibility, all of it combined to create a psychological space where normal moral boundaries seem to blur. This experiment shows that even in the innocence of childhood, the loss of individuality can unleash impulses that usually stay hidden. It forces us to confront the unsettling truth that our moral compass is strengthened not just by who we are, but by the awareness that others can see us. Strip away that visibility, and even the gentlest heart can slip into behaviors that feel foreign, impulsive, and disturbingly unrestrained. The door-in-the-face persuasion study. The door-in-the-face persuasion study is one of the most fascinating demonstrations of how easily the human mind can be steered, nudged, and softened into agreement through nothing more than strategic contrast. Psychologist Robert Cialdini and his colleagues uncovered this effect by asking people to volunteer for an absurdly demanding task, mentoring troubled youth for 2 hours a week for 2 full years. Predictably, almost everyone said no, but then came the twist. After rejecting the overwhelming request, participants were immediately offered a far smaller one, chaperoning a single group of kids on a short trip to the zoo. Suddenly, the compliance rate skyrocketed. People who had firmly declined the first request were now saying yes with surprising enthusiasm. The brilliance of this study lies in what it reveals about human psychology. When we say no to something huge, we often feel a subtle pang of guilt, a tension between protecting our boundaries and wanting to appear helpful or fair. So when a smaller request follows, our minds leap at the chance to restore balance, to feel cooperative, to ease the discomfort created by the initial refusal. The giant request doesn't fail. It sets the stage. It makes the smaller request feel reasonable, even generous, by comparison. This experiment exposes a deeply emotional truth. People aren't just influenced by what they're asked to do, but by the context surrounding the request. A no can be transformed into a yes simply by allowing someone to feel that they're compromising rather than surrendering. The door-in-the-face effect shows how easily obligation can be manufactured, how guilt can be used as leverage, and how quickly the mind reaches for harmony, often without realizing it's being guided there. The Foot in the Door Compliance Study. The Foot in the Door Compliance Study uncovers a fascinating yet unsettling truth about human behavior. Once we say yes to something small, we become far more likely to agree to something bigger, even if we normally wouldn't. Researchers first asked people for a tiny request, something so harmless it felt impossible to refuse: a signature for a petition, a quick survey, a small favor at the door. And once the participants complied, something powerful shifted inside them. When the researchers later returned with a far larger, more demanding request, most people agreed without realizing how dramatically their boundaries had moved. What makes this study so emotionally striking is that the transformation doesn't happen through pressure or manipulation, but through our own desire to remain consistent with who we believe we are. That first yes reshapes identity in a subtle way. If you sign a petition about safe driving, you unconsciously adopt the identity of someone who cares about the cause. So when you're asked to place a massive, ugly billboard in your front yard promoting safe driving, the request no longer feels like an intrusion. It feels like a continuation of the person you already committed to being. The study exposes how fragile our sense of autonomy can be, how easily our values can be nudged without us noticing. A small agreement opens a psychological doorway, making the next step feel natural, even when it stretches far beyond what we would have accepted initially. It shows how marketers, politicians, and manipulators gain influence, not by demanding big sacrifices up front, but by securing something tiny: your time, your attention, your signature, and letting your own mind do the rest. The foot in the door effect reveals how compliance begins quietly, with a whisper of agreement that grows into something far larger than we ever intended. The Overjustification Toy Study. The Overjustification Toy Study is one of the most emotionally revealing demonstrations of how fragile human motivation truly is, especially in children whose curiosity and joy are still pure and unfiltered. In this experiment, researchers invited children to play with a set of attractive toys, something they naturally enjoyed. Their excitement was genuine, effortless, and deeply intrinsic. But then the researchers introduced a twist. Some children were told they would receive a reward for playing with the toys. Suddenly, the spark shifted. What had once been an expression of natural joy became a task performed for a prize. Later, when the reward was removed and the children were simply invited to play again, something heartbreaking happened. The children who once loved the toys lost interest. Their excitement faded. The reward had quietly rewritten the meaning of their pleasure. This experiment exposes a powerful psychological truth. When an external reward intrudes on something we enjoy, it can suffocate the inner desire that made it meaningful in the first place. The children didn't stop playing because the toys became less fun. They stopped because the reward taught their minds a new story. You're doing this for the prize, not for yourself. What makes this study so deeply emotional is how closely it mirrors the way passion can fade in real life. A hobby becomes a job, a joy becomes an obligation, a natural love becomes something measured, evaluated, and judged. The Overjustification study reveals how easily external pressure can steal the magic from something that once made us feel alive, showing that the human spirit doesn't thrive on rewards. It thrives on freedom, curiosity, and the quiet joy of doing something simply because it feels right. The Loftus Car Crash Wording Study. The Loftus Car Crash Wording Study is a stunning reminder of how fragile memory truly is, how easily the truth can be bent, reshaped, or completely rewritten by something as subtle as a single word. Elizabeth Loftus showed participants a video of a car accident and then asked them questions about what they saw. The twist came in the phrasing. Some were asked how fast the cars were going when they hit each other. Others were asked the same question, but with a different verb, smashed. That one word, that tiny shift in language, changed everything. Those who heard smashed reported higher speeds, more violence, and even remembered shattered glass that never existed. Their minds created details to match the intensity suggested by the wording, filling in gaps with imagined fragments that felt real. What makes this study so emotionally unsettling is what it reveals about us. Our memories feel sacred, solid, and trustworthy, yet they can be manipulated with terrifying ease. A single suggestion can plant images that never happen, sculpting our recollections into something new, while convincing us it was always there. The experiment proves that memory isn't a recording, it's a story constantly being edited, revised, and influenced by the world around us. It forces us to confront the disturbing truth that what we remember might not be memory at all, but persuasion in disguise. It shows how witnesses can become unreliable without knowing it, how relationships can fracture over recollections that feel unquestionable, and how fragile the boundary is between reality and belief. The Loftus study reveals that the mind doesn't just store experiences, it rewrites them, often without our permission, leaving us to trust a version of the past that may never have existed. The Parietal Reach Region Brain Mapping Study. The Parietal Reach Region Brain Mapping Study is one of the most captivating insights into how the brain constructs our movements long before we're even aware of them, revealing how intention forms in the shadows of the mind. Neuroscientists discovered a specific area in the posterior parietal cortex, the parietal reach region, or PRR, that becomes active not when we move, but when we intend to move. What makes this so mind-blowing is that the PRR fires even before we consciously decide to reach for something. It lights up in anticipation, silently calculating trajectories, distances, and outcomes, as if the brain is planning our future actions behind our backs. In these studies, participants were shown targets and asked to reach toward them or simply think about doing so. The PRR became active not in response to motion, but in response to desire. The moment someone merely considered reaching, this part of the brain constructed a detailed blueprint of the movement, mapping out the arm's path as though the action had already begun. This reveals a startling truth. Intention is not born in consciousness. It emerges deeper, earlier, crafted by neural circuits that decide before we do. The PRR exposes how the mind prepares our bodies for action, milliseconds, or even seconds, before we can explain why we want something. It shows why impulses feel sudden, why our hands move toward objects almost automatically, and why cravings can feel like they appear out of nowhere. The study forces us to confront how much of our behavior is orchestrated silently inside us, shaped by neural preparation that guides our actions before awareness ever catches up. It challenges the belief that we are fully in control, revealing that the brain begins writing our next move long before we realize we're about to make it. The Lateral Hypothalamus Eating Behavior Study. The Lateral Hypothalamus Eating Behavior Study uncovered a startling truth about how deeply the brain controls our most basic urges. revealing that hunger is not just a feeling, it's a command written into the wiring of our survival. Researchers discovered that when the lateral hypothalamus, a tiny region buried deep within the brain, was stimulated in animals, they began eating with an intensity that felt almost desperate. Food became an obsession. Even when they had just finished eating, even when they weren't hungry, the stimulation triggered a powerful drive that pushed them to devour anything available. But when this same area was damaged or removed, the opposite happened. Animals stopped eating entirely. Food lost all meaning. They walked past meals with no interest, as if the internal signal that once whispered, "Eat to survive," had been completely silenced. What makes this study emotionally gripping is how it exposes the invisible strings pulling at our desires. Hunger isn't simply a conscious choice or a passing craving. It's a neurological force that shapes behavior, mood, and even identity. The animals in the experiment weren't acting greedy or disciplined. They were responding to a biological switch that dictated their will. That realization hits hard because it reflects a truth about human life as well. There are instincts we think we control, feelings we believe come from our preferences or habits, when in reality they originate from deep, ancient circuits that decide what we fear, crave, and chase. The lateral hypothalamus study forces us to see hunger through a new lens, not as a simple bodily sensation, but as a powerful survival script written into the brain. It reveals how fragile our balance truly is, and how easily a small shift in the mind's wiring can turn one of the most basic human experiences into an overwhelming force or a vanished instinct. The Visual Cliff Depth Perception Test. The Visual Cliff Depth Perception Test is one of the most emotionally striking experiments ever conducted on infants because it captures the exact moment when instinct, fear, and trust collide inside a developing mind. Created by Eleanor Gibson and Richard Walk in the 1960s, the setup looks simple: a table covered with solid glass, half of it appearing normal, and the other half designed to look like a steep drop, a cliff. To an adult, the glass was obviously safe, but to the crawling babies placed at the edge, the illusion was powerful enough to trigger hesitation, fear, and an instinctive awareness of danger they had never been taught. Mothers stood on the other side, calling their babies to cross the cliff. Some infants inched forward, trembling with uncertainty. Others froze completely, their tiny bodies refusing to move as their instincts screamed warnings they couldn't put into words. What makes this study so emotionally gripping is the rawness of it, the pure, unfiltered struggle between curiosity and survival. Even without experience, without stories of danger, without a single fall in their memory, babies sensed depth and refused to risk it. The mind already knew that some spaces are safe and others are not, proving that perception isn't built entirely from learning. It's woven into us from the beginning. But the study revealed something else just as profound. When mothers showed calm, encouraging expressions, some babies found the courage to cross. When mothers looked fearful, even subtly, the babies recoiled instantly. It was a powerful reminder that the emotional signals we give off shape how others move through the world, sometimes giving them the courage to step forward, other times teaching them to fear the place where the ground seems to disappear beneath them. The Strange Situation Attachment Pattern Study. The Strange Situation Attachment Pattern Study is one of the most emotionally revealing experiments ever conducted on the bonds between children and their caregivers. Designed by Mary Ainsworth, it placed infants in a carefully structured series of separations and reunions with their mothers while a stranger was present. What unfolded was far more profound than simple child behavior. It exposed the invisible emotional blueprint shaping how we learn to trust, depend, and connect with others for the rest of our lives. When the mother left the room, some infants cried, but were easily comforted upon her return. Others showed a heartbreaking mix of longing and anger, clinging one moment and resisting the next. Some barely reacted at all, acting as if they didn't care, yet their racing heartbeats revealed the truth, pain hidden beneath emotional shutdown. What makes this study so deeply stirring is how it captures the raw, unfiltered expression of attachment before a child has words to explain their feelings. These patterns weren't random. They reflected how consistently the child's emotional needs had been met. Securely attached children trusted that comfort would return. Anxious ones feared the inconsistency of love. Avoidant infants protected themselves by shutting down, learning that vulnerability brought disappointment. The most distressed, the disorganized, showed fear toward the very person meant to be their safe place. This experiment exposes something almost painful to acknowledge. The way we love as adults often echoes the way we were comforted or left waiting as infants. The strange situation shows that attachment is not just a childhood phase, but a silent architect shaping how we bond, fear abandonment, push people away, or cling too tightly, revealing how our earliest moments of separation and reunion can leave emotional fingerprints on us for life. The Split Brain Hemisphere Specialization Study. The Split Brain Hemisphere Specialization Study is one of the most astonishing revelations about the hidden duality within the human mind, exposing how the brain can function as two separate consciousnesses living inside a single person. Conducted by Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga, the study involved patients whose corpus callosum, the bridge connecting the two hemispheres, had been severed to treat severe epilepsy. No one expected what came next. When the hemispheres were no longer able to communicate, something extraordinary happened. Each side of the brain began acting with its own intentions, perceptions, and understanding of the world. The left hemisphere, dominant in language, could speak, reason, and explain. The right hemisphere, silent but perceptive, could recognize faces, interpret emotions, and respond through actions, even though it had no voice. In experiments, the right hemisphere could see an object and guide the hand toward it, while the left hemisphere insisted it saw nothing. Sometimes the patient's hands would even contradict each other, one buttoning a shirt while the other unbuttoned it, as if two minds were quietly wrestling for control. What makes this study so mind-shattering is how clearly it exposes that consciousness is not a single, unified experience. Instead, it is a fragile collaboration between brain systems negotiating reality every moment of the day. When that connection is cut, the illusion of a unified self dissolves. The findings reveal that much of what we believe is us, our choices, impulses, reactions, may arise from neural processes we never see, never hear, and never consciously command. The split brain study forces us to confront the unnerving idea that beneath our seamless sense of identity lies a divided, complex machinery, one that can fracture into separate selves the moment its connection breaks. The Learned Taste Aversion, Garcia Effect Study. The Learned Taste Aversion, Garcia Effect Study reveals a powerful and deeply emotional truth about survival. The brain will do anything to protect us, even if it means rewriting our desires in a single, unforgettable moment. Conducted by John Garcia, the experiment showed that animals, especially rats, could learn to fear or reject a specific food after just one bad experience. If they consumed something and later became sick, even hours afterward, their minds formed an instant, unshakable association. A flavor they once enjoyed suddenly became a symbol of danger. They would avoid it completely, sometimes reacting with visible disgust or panic, as though the memory of the illness had fused itself into the taste forever. What makes this study so striking is how dramatically it breaks the usual rules of learning. Most behaviors require repetition to take hold, but taste aversion can form after a single pairing, as if the brain senses the emergency and engraves the lesson in survival-level ink. This isn't just about food, it's about the raw power of emotional memory. The Garcia Effect reveals how one traumatic event can alter our preferences, habits, and reactions long into the future. A single night of food poisoning can make someone avoid a dish for years. A smell associated with sickness can trigger nausea on its own. The mind remembers the danger long after the body has healed. This experiment exposes how closely survival and emotion are intertwined. The brain doesn't wait for logic or confirmation. It responds with instinct, protection, and urgency. It shows how one moment of pain can permanently reshape behavior, leaving behind a psychological scar disguised as avoidance, reminding us just how fiercely the mind works to keep us alive, even through fear. The Endowment Effect experiments. The Endowment Effect experiments reveal one of the most surprising and deeply emotional biases in human decision-making. The moment we own something, even briefly, we begin to see it as part of ourselves. In these studies, participants were randomly given simple objects like mugs or pens. Nothing valuable, nothing sentimental. Moments later, researchers asked them how much they'd sell the item for. The results were astonishing. People demanded far more money to give up an item they had owned for only minutes than they would ever have paid to acquire it. Something ordinary instantly became precious, simply because it was theirs. What makes this experiment so emotionally powerful is what it uncovers beneath the surface. Ownership isn't just about possession, it's about identity, attachment, and the fear of loss. The mind clings, not because the object has changed, but because letting go suddenly feels like giving up a piece of oneself. The value becomes emotional, not logical. It reflects the quiet stories we create the moment something enters our world. This is mine. This belongs with me. Losing it would hurt. The Endowment Effect reveals how quickly the human heart forms attachments, even to things that seem meaningless moments before. It shows why people keep objects they never use, stay in relationships long after the love has faded, or resist change even when it promises something better. The bias isn't about greed, it's about the instinctive desire to protect what feels connected to us. These experiments expose a tender truth. Humans don't value things because they're valuable. We value them because they become woven into the tapestry of who we believe ourselves to be, and the idea of losing them feels like tearing out a thread we didn't realize we were holding on to. The Bystander Smoke-Filled Room Study. The Bystander Smoke-Filled Room Study is one of the most unsettling demonstrations of how people can ignore danger, even when their lives might be at risk, simply because no one else is reacting. Conducted by B. Blatane and John Darley, the experiment placed participants in a room to fill out a questionnaire. At first, everything seemed normal until smoke began seeping through a vent, curling into the air, thickening slowly like the warning breath of an unseen fire. When people were alone, they almost always jumped up, sought help, or left the room immediately. But when they were placed with others who had been instructed to act calm and unconcerned, something frightening happened. Most participants stayed seated, coughing, rubbing their eyes, glancing nervously around, but doing nothing. What makes this study so emotionally gripping is the silent, psychological battle unfolding inside those individuals. Their instincts screamed that something was wrong, yet the lack of reaction from the group overpowered their fear. They doubted themselves. They dismissed their own senses. They convinced themselves that if no one else was worried, maybe the danger wasn't real. The experiment revealed a chilling truth about human behavior. People are far more likely to freeze when others are passive, even when the threat is visible, growing, and literally filling the room around them. This study forces us to confront how deeply social cues can override survival instincts. It shows how easily people surrender personal judgment to maintain the comfort of group conformity, and it exposes the terrifying possibility that in moments of crisis, the presence of others, far from protecting us, can paralyze us, leaving us trapped in inaction while danger quietly rises at our feet. The Gazzaniga Interpreter Illusion Study. The Gazzaniga Interpreter Illusion Study is one of the most unsettling windows into how the brain fabricates reality, revealing that the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and why we act may be nothing more than illusions created after the fact. Michael Gazzaniga discovered the interpreter while studying split-brain patients, individuals whose left and right hemispheres could no longer communicate. What he found was astonishing. When the right hemisphere received information that the left hemisphere could not access, the patient's body would respond appropriately, yet the speaking hemisphere, the left, had no idea why the action happened. Instead of admitting confusion, the left hemisphere instantly invented a logical explanation, delivering it with confidence and sincerity, even though the reasoning was completely false. For example, if the right hemisphere was shown a command like stand up, the patient would rise from their seat. When asked why, the left hemisphere, unable to see the command, would calmly explain, "Oh, I felt like getting a drink," or "My legs were stiff." It wasn't lying. It genuinely believed its own story. This experiment reveals a haunting truth. The brain hates gaps in understanding, so it fills them with meaning, even if the meaning is fabricated. It shows that the mind doesn't just process reality, it edits it, rewrites it, and convinces us the story was true all along. The interpreter exposes how often our decisions come first and our explanations come second, how our sense of self may be stitched together from guesses, and how easily we can mistake narrative for truth. It reveals that the voice in our head, the one we trust most, is not always a witness. Sometimes is a storyteller trying desperately to make chaos feel coherent. The Pygmalion/Rosenthal Teacher Expectation Study. The Pygmalion/Rosenthal Teacher Expectation Study reveals one of the most emotionally powerful forces in human development. The expectations of others can quietly shape who we become, sometimes more than our own abilities. In this groundbreaking experiment, teachers were told that certain students, randomly selected without the teachers knowing, were poised for sudden intellectual growth. There was no special talent, no hidden potential, no secret advantage, only a label. Yet, as the school year unfolded, something astonishing happened. Those very students began performing better, learning faster, and showing remarkable improvement, as if the simple belief in their potential had breathed new life into their minds. What makes this study so deeply moving is how subtle the transformation was. Teachers didn't intentionally give these students special treatment. Instead, their quiet expectations seeped into everyday interactions. They smiled more, encouraged more, explained more patiently, offered more opportunities, and interpreted mistakes as growth rather than failure. The students, absorbing this warmth and belief, began seeing themselves differently. Their confidence grew, their curiosity stretched. They stepped into the identity that others had unknowingly crafted for them. The heartbreaking side of this discovery is equally powerful. If positive expectations can lift someone higher, negative expectations can hold them down just as easily. A child labeled as average or difficult may receive fewer smiles, less patience, and little belief, and over time, they internalize the limitations placed on them. The Pygmalion Effect exposes a profound truth. People often rise or fall to meet the expectations that surround them. It shows how the quiet assumptions of authority figures can become invisible hands, shaping destinies not through force, but through belief, revealing that sometimes the most life-changing power in the world is simply someone expecting greatness. The Hawthorne Productivity Effect Study. The Hawthorne Productivity Effect Study is one of the most eye-opening revelations about human behavior in the workplace, because it shows that people don't just respond to conditions, they respond to being seen. Conducted in the 1920s and 1930s at the Western Electric Hawthorne Works, researchers wanted to find out how different lighting levels affected worker productivity. They brightened the lights, and productivity rose. They dimmed the lights, and productivity rose again. Nothing made sense until the researchers realized the truth. It wasn't the lighting at all. It was the attention. The workers changed their behavior because they knew they were being observed, monitored, and treated as individuals whose actions mattered. What makes this study so emotionally powerful is how deeply it taps into a quiet human longing, the desire to feel valued. These workers weren't performing better because of environmental improvements. They were performing better because someone finally cared enough to notice them. The presence of researchers made them feel important, visible, and acknowledged in a job that once treated them like interchangeable parts. Their productivity became a reflection of their renewed sense of worth. But the Hawthorne effect reveals something even more profound about human psychology. People don't thrive on conditions alone. They thrive on connection, recognition, and meaning. When someone feels invisible, their motivation fades. When someone feels seen, their potential ignites. This study is a striking reminder that human performance is shaped not just by physical circumstances, but by emotional ones. The sense that our efforts matter, that someone is watching with interest rather than indifference, and that our presence in the world does not go unnoticed. The What is Beautiful is Good bias study. The What is Beautiful is Good bias study reveals one of the most quietly devastating truths about human judgment. People often believe that physical attractiveness signals goodness, intelligence, and moral worth, even when there is absolutely no evidence to support it. Conducted by Karen Dion, Ellen Bearsheed, and Elaine Walster, the experiment asked participants to read descriptions of individuals and then rate their personalities. The only difference between the profiles was appearance. The results were deeply unsettling. Attractive people were consistently judged as kinder, happier, more successful, and even more trustworthy, while those considered less attractive were seen as less capable, less warm, and less deserving. What makes this experiment so emotionally jarring is how effortlessly the mind assigns value based on something as superficial as a face. The study shows that humans don't just notice beauty, we elevate it. We wrap it in assumptions, projecting goodness onto someone simply because their features align with society's shifting, fragile standards, and the damage doesn't stop there. The bias shapes opportunities, friendships, careers, punishments, and even love. Attractive individuals receive more leniency, more praise, more second chances. Meanwhile, those who don't fit the ideal often feel unseen, underestimated, or dismissed before they ever speak a word. This experiment forces us to confront a painful reality. The world isn't shaped by fairness, it's shaped by perception, and perception is easily distorted. The beautiful is good bias exposes how quickly admiration can turn into favoritism, how easily external charm becomes confused with internal worth, and how many lives are quietly shaped or limited by judgments others don't even realize they're making. It reveals that beneath our claims of equality, the human mind still bows to beauty, granting unearned advantages to some while leaving others fighting invisible battles they never asked to face. The Social Loafing Rope Pull Study. The Social Loafing Rope Pull Study is one of the most revealing and unsettling discoveries about how human motivation quietly collapses in groups, exposing a truth we often don't want to admit. People give less effort when they believe others will pick up the slack. In the 1970s, psychologist Bib Latané and his colleagues had participants pull on a rope, measuring the force of each pull. When individuals pulled alone, they gave it everything they had, but when they were told they were pulling with a group, even when the others weren't actually pulling at all, their effort dropped dramatically. The more people they thought were involved, the less strength they used. It wasn't laziness, it was something deeper, more instinctive. The moment responsibility becomes shared, the mind quietly releases its grip. The urgency dissolves. The sense of personal importance fades. Responsibility becomes diluted, and with it, motivation slips away. What makes this study so emotionally striking is how clearly it mirrors real life. In group projects, workplace teams, friendships, and even families, people often assume someone else will handle the hard parts. Decisions are left to others. Effort is reduced to the bare minimum needed to blend into the crowd. The rope pull experiment reveals a painful psychological truth. People feel safest when they disappear into the group, but that safety comes at the cost of authenticity, initiative, and personal power. It shows how easily individuality can be swallowed by collective presence, how effort crumbles when no one is watching, and how quickly we can surrender our strengths when we believe they're no longer uniquely needed. The Sleep Deprivation Hallucination Study. The Sleep Deprivation Hallucination Study exposes a haunting truth about the human mind. When stripped of sleep, reality begins to unravel, and the brain turns against itself in ways that feel terrifyingly real. Researchers kept participants awake far beyond normal limits, pushing them past exhaustion and into the fragile territory where the mind can no longer distinguish imagination from truth. At first, the subjects simply felt tired, unfocused, irritated, but as the hours stretched into days, something far more disturbing began to happen. Their thoughts fractured, their senses twisted, harmless shadows morphed into figures watching them, soft sounds grew into whispers that seemed to call their names. Some participants saw insects crawling along walls that were perfectly clean, while others believed someone was standing behind them when no one was there at all. What makes this study so emotionally gripping is how quickly the mind loses its grip on stability when deprived of rest. Sleep isn't just a break, it's the system that keeps our reality intact. Without it, the brain begins firing wildly, blending memories, fears, and fantasies into vivid hallucinations that feel as undeniable as the ground beneath us. Participants described feeling trapped inside their own minds, terrified by visions they knew shouldn't exist, yet couldn't dismiss. Their emotional walls crumbled, paranoia surged, anxiety spiked, and even gentle noises triggered overwhelming dread. The study reveals how delicate our sanity truly is, how much we rely on sleep to clear the mind and keep our perceptions grounded. It shows that beneath the surface of wakefulness lies a fragile balance, and when that balance breaks, the world becomes distorted, untrustworthy, and frighteningly unstable. It's a powerful reminder that even the strongest minds can fracture when denied the rest they desperately need. The Placebo Pain Relief Experiment. The Placebo Pain Relief Experiment is one of the most astonishing demonstrations of the mind's hidden power, its ability to soothe, numb, and even heal simply because it believes it can. In these studies, participants suffering from pain were given what they thought was a real pain relief medication. In reality, it was nothing more than a sugar pill, no active ingredients, no chemical effects, no medical power. Yet something miraculous happened. Their pain eased, their bodies relaxed, some even reported near complete relief. The mind, convinced that healing was on the way, triggered real biological changes. Endorphins surged, stress signals quieted, and the brain's pain centers dimmed as if an actual drug had been administered. What makes this experiment so emotionally gripping is how deeply it exposes the silent dialogue between belief and the body. Pain isn't just physical, it's woven with expectation, fear, and hope. When participants swallowed the placebo, they weren't cured by chemicals, they were healed by trust, by the belief that relief was possible, by the hope that their suffering could finally loosen its grip. The body followed the story, the mind believed. But the true emotional impact comes from what the experiment reveals about human resilience. It shows that within every person is an untapped reservoir of strength, one that can be awakened by belief alone. The placebo effect isn't a trick or illusion. It's a reminder that the mind can rewire the body's experience, turning expectation into medicine. It exposes a powerful truth we often overlook. Sometimes the greatest healing force isn't found in a pill, but in the quiet conviction that things can get better, that the body can listen to the whispers of hope and respond in ways that feel nothing short of extraordinary. The Nocebo Adverse Expectation Study. The Nocebo Adverse Expectation Study is one of the most haunting demonstrations of how the mind can create suffering entirely on its own. In this experiment, participants were told they might experience negative side effects from a harmless substance, a sugar pill, a fake treatment, or even a simple procedure with no physiological impact. What happened next was nothing short of chilling. People began reporting headaches, nausea, anxiety, dizziness, and even pain intense enough to make them stop the study. Their bodies reacted as if danger were real, even though nothing harmful had touched them. The expectation of suffering became the cause of suffering. What makes this experiment so emotionally striking is the raw vulnerability it exposes within all of us. It reveals that fear is not just felt, it can be embodied. The brain, convinced that something bad is coming, sends shockwaves through the nervous system, tightening muscles, altering heart rate, releasing stress hormones, and triggering physical symptoms with the same force as an actual threat. The participants weren't imagining their pain. Their bodies were faithfully responding to a story their minds believed. The nocebo effect shows that words, warnings, and expectations can carve pain into someone's reality without a single physical cause. It explains why medical diagnoses can devastate, why self-doubt can make us sick, and why anxiety sometimes feels like a physical attack from the inside. It reveals how easily the brain's protective instincts can turn destructive, creating harm where none exists. This experiment forces us to confront the unsettling truth that the mind can become its own source of poison. The belief in danger can be as damaging as danger itself, proving that sometimes the stories we fear the most are the ones our bodies listen to with terrifying obedience. The Dunker Candle Functional Fixedness Test. The Dunker Candle Functional Fixedness Test is one of the most eye-opening demonstrations of how the human mind can trap itself, how we become prisoners of our own expectations without ever realizing it. Carl Dunker's experiment began with a simple setup: a candle, a box of tacks, and a book of matches. Participants were told to attach the candle to the wall in a way that would prevent wax from dripping onto the table. The solution was deceptively simple: empty the tack box, use it as a platform, and tack the box to the wall. But most people never saw it. They stared at the box and tacks as separate objects, unable to imagine that the box itself could become part of the solution. Their minds were locked in functional fixedness, a mental rigidity that blinds us to possibilities when objects appear tied to a single purpose. What makes this study so emotionally gripping is how painfully it reflects the way people live their lives. We become trapped by assumptions, routines, roles, and stories about who we are and what we're capable of. We look at problems through narrow frames, convinced the tools we have aren't enough, when the real prison is the way we're thinking. The candle test shows that limitations aren't always external. They're often psychological, shaped by the invisible boundaries we place around ordinary things and even around ourselves. The experiment forces us to confront a simple but unsettling truth. Sometimes the solution is right in front of us, but our minds refuse to see it because it doesn't fit the pattern we expect. It reveals how creativity can be suffocated by familiarity, how innovation dies in the grip of habit, and how often we remain stuck not because we lack resources, but because we fail to reimagine the ones we already have. The Müller-Lyer Illusion Study. The Müller-Lyer Illusion Study reveals a powerful truth about perception. Even when we know what we're seeing is wrong, our minds stubbornly hold on to the lie. In this experiment, participants were shown two lines of equal length, one tipped with inward arrows, the other with outward arrows. Logic should make the answer obvious. The lines are identical, yet almost everyone insisted that one line was longer than the other. Their eyes weren't deceiving them, their brains were. What makes this illusion so deeply unsettling is how effortlessly the mind distorts reality while convincing us that we're seeing truth. As researchers repeated the experiment across cultures, ages, and environments, people continued falling for the illusion. The arrows, simple as they looked, acted like psychological traps, manipulating the brain's automatic interpretations of depth and distance. The inward arrows made the line feel closer, compressed, almost shrinking before our eyes. The outward arrows suggested distance, expansion, and space, stretching the line in our perception, even though the measurements never changed. This wasn't a flaw in eyesight, it was a flaw in assumption, a glimpse into the shortcuts the mind uses to make sense of the world. What makes the Müller-Lyer illusion so emotionally gripping is the unsettling realization it leaves behind. If our brains can distort something as simple as a line, how many other things in life are we misjudging without knowing? How often do we trust first impressions, appearances, or snap judgments that are nothing more than mental illusions dressed as truth? The study reveals how fragile perception truly is, how easily reality bends under hidden cognitive biases, and how the mind can cling to a false belief even after it's been exposed. It's a reminder that seeing is not always believing. Sometimes it's just the brain's most convincing trick. The Facial Feedback Pencil Study. The Facial Feedback Pencil Study is one of the most beautifully unsettling demonstrations of how deeply our emotions are intertwined with the smallest movements of our bodies, movements we barely notice, yet ones that quietly shape the way we feel. Conducted by Fritz Strack and his colleagues in the 1980s, the experiment asked participants to hold a pencil in their mouth in ways that either forced their facial muscles into something resembling a smile or something resembling a frown. They weren't told anything about emotions. They weren't asked to pretend to be happy or sad. They simply held a pencil, an action so trivial it seemed meaningless, yet when they later rated a series of cartoons, something remarkable happened. The smilers found them funnier, warmer, more enjoyable. The frowners found them duller and less amusing. Their facial expressions had quietly whispered instructions to their brains, reshaping their emotional experience without them ever realizing it. What makes this study so emotionally powerful is the way it exposes the fragile boundaries between our bodies and our feelings. We like to believe our emotions come from deep, powerful places, memories, relationships, traumas, triumphs. But this experiment reveals a gentler, more surprising truth. Sometimes emotions grow from the tiniest physical cues. A small tilt of the mouth can brighten a moment. A slight tightening can dim it. The body sends a signal and the mind follows. It's a haunting reminder of how much control we unknowingly have over our inner world. A simple shift in posture, a subtle movement of muscle, a change we barely notice can ripple inward, altering the lens through which we experience life. This study reveals that emotion isn't just something we feel, it's something we participate in, even in the smallest, most unconscious ways. The Lost in the Mall False Memory Study. The Lost in the Mall False Memory Study is one of the most unsettling revelations about how easily the human mind can be persuaded to believe a past that never happened. Designed by Elizabeth Loftus, the experiment exposed participants to a series of childhood memories provided by their family, stories rooted in truth. Except for one, hidden among the real events was a fabricated tale of being lost in a shopping mall as a child, complete with emotional details meant to sound believable. At first, many participants insisted it had never happened, But as the interviews continued, something eerie unfolded. People began to remember the fictional event, adding descriptions of the strangers they imagined helping them, the fear they believed they felt, even the clothing they thought they were wearing that day. What makes this study so emotionally gripping is the realization that memory can be rewritten, not just through trauma, but through gentle suggestion. These weren't gullible people. They were ordinary individuals whose minds filled in gaps with imagined fragments until the invented memory felt as vivid and real as anything they'd lived through. The brain desperately tries to make stories coherent, even if it means fabricating entire experiences. The Lost in the Mall study forces us to confront a disturbing truth. Our past is not as stable as we believe. The memories we cling to, the ones that shape our identity, our fears, our relationships, can be contaminated, molded, or entirely constructed without our awareness. It reveals how vulnerable the mind is to influence, how easily a false narrative can take root, and how quickly imagination can masquerade as history. It leaves us questioning not just what we remember, but how much of our lives may be built on stories our minds quietly created in the dark. The expectancy theory, Maze-Bright versus Maze-Dull rats. The expectancy theory, Maze-Bright versus Maze-Dull rats, study is one of the most astonishing proofs of how powerful belief can be. So powerful it can reshape behavior, performance, and even destiny without anyone realizing it's happening. In this experiment, researchers gave two groups of students identical rats and told one group their rats were maze-bright, genetically gifted at navigating mazes, while the other group was told their rats were maze-dull, expected to perform poorly. None of it was true. The rats were completely average, but what happened next was extraordinary. The students who believed their rats were intelligent handled them more gently, encouraged them more patiently, and expected them to succeed. Their rats, treated with care and confidence, actually began performing better, running through the maze faster and making fewer mistakes. Meanwhile, the rats labeled dull were treated with less warmth, less belief, less hope, and their performance declined accordingly. This experiment delivers a deeply emotional blow because it exposes how expectation shapes reality, not just for rats, but for people. It reveals how teachers' beliefs mold students' abilities, how parents' expectations shape their children's confidence, and how partners' assumptions quietly influence each other's growth. When someone believes in you, their behavior shifts, subtly, consistently, until you begin to rise to meet their vision, and when they expect little, their doubt becomes a cage you slowly grow to fit. The maze-bright rats succeeded not because they were gifted, but because someone believed they were worth rooting for. The maze-dull rats failed not because they lacked ability, but because no one expected them to shine. The study forces us to confront how often we trap others and ourselves inside invisible walls built entirely from belief. The Stroop color word interference test. The Stroop color word interference test exposes a startling truth about the human mind. Even the simplest tasks can become battles when our brain is forced to confront conflicting information. In this experiment, participants were shown words of colors like red, blue, or green, but the ink used to print the word was a different color. The task seemed laughably simple: say the color of the ink, not the word. Yet the moment people tried, their minds stumbled, their voices hesitated, their thoughts tangled. Saying blue when the word read red felt strangely difficult, as though the brain were pulling them in two directions at once. What makes this study so emotionally striking is the realization that our thinking isn't as smooth or controlled as we like to believe. Automatic processes, fast, instinctive, deeply ingrained, collide with deliberate ones, and suddenly the mind becomes a battlefield. The word leaps forward in your brain before the color even has a chance, and resisting that impulse takes effort.
You can feel participants describe frustration rising in their chest, their focus slipping like sand through their fingers, their confidence wavering with every mistake. It wasn't just a test. It was a confrontation with the invisible forces inside the mind that operate without permission. The Stroop test reveals how easily attention can be hijacked, how hard it is to override habits, and how even the smallest mental conflict can expose the limits of our control. It shows that the brain is constantly fighting its own shortcuts, battling between what we see and what we've been conditioned to read, reminding us that beneath our calm surface lies a mind struggling to stay aligned with intention. The Yerkes-Dodson Arousal Curve Experiment. The Yerkes-Dodson Arousal Curve Experiment is one of the most hauntingly accurate reflections of the human struggle between pressure and performance, revealing the razor-thin line between being motivated and being overwhelmed. Conducted in 1908 by Robert Yerkes and John Dodson, the study began with a simple observation. Mice learned tasks faster when mildly stimulated, but when the stimulation became too intense, too loud, too stressful, their performance collapsed. That quiet discovery evolved into one of psychology's most powerful truths. There is a point where stress sharpens us and a point where it breaks us. What makes this experiment so emotionally gripping is how deeply it mirrors the hidden battles inside every human life. When pressure rises just enough, we come alive, our focus sharpens, our energy surges, and our minds lock onto the task with a fierce clarity. This is the sweet spot, the peak of the curve, where ambition feels electric and we feel capable of almost anything, but push just a little further, add just a little more weight, and everything begins to unravel. Stress stops energizing and starts suffocating. Thoughts scatter, confidence wavers, and the same pressure that once fueled us begins to crush us from within. The Yerkes-Dodson law reveals that breakdowns don't happen out of weakness. They happen because every mind has a limit, a hidden threshold where resilience transforms into overload. It explains why students freeze during exams, why athletes choke under the spotlight, why professionals burn out even when they once thrived. The experiment uncovers a truth we often refuse to admit. Success is not just about pushing harder. It's about knowing when the push becomes too much, when the climb turns into a fall, and when the pressure meant to empower us quietly becomes the force that unravels us. The overconfidence cognitive bias experiments. The overconfidence cognitive bias. Experiments reveal a deeply unsettling truth about the human mind. We often believe we know far more than we actually do. In these studies, participants were asked to answer questions, estimate probabilities, or make predictions, and then rate how confident they were in those answers. The results were startling. Time and time again, people expressed absolute certainty about facts they got completely wrong. They weren't guessing blindly. They genuinely believed in their own accuracy, even when their confidence towered far above their actual performance. What makes these experiments so emotionally striking is what they expose beneath the surface. Overconfidence is not arrogance. It's a quiet illusion woven into how the brain protects our sense of competence and control. People weren't trying to impress anyone. They were trying to trust themselves, yet their trust was misplaced, creating a fragile, dangerous gap between what they believed they could do and what they were actually capable of. The experiments show how overconfidence leads people to underestimate risks, ignore warnings, and leap into decisions with blind faith in their own judgment. It explains why students fail tests they thought they aced, why investors make reckless bets, why relationships fall apart under the weight of assumptions, and why disasters occur when leaders insist they're right despite clear evidence they're not. The mind clings to certainty because uncertainty feels like a threat, but that certainty can become its own trap. What makes the findings haunting is how universal the bias is. It doesn't spare the intelligent, the experienced, or the cautious. Anyone can fall into the illusion of believing their answers are correct simply because they feel correct. The overconfidence experiments expose how easily the mind confuses confidence with truth, leaving us walking through life far more blind than we dare to admit. The Mere Exposure Effect Study. The Mere Exposure Effect Study is one of the most quietly astonishing discoveries in psychology, revealing how effortlessly familiarity can reshape our feelings, our preferences, and even our sense of connection, often without us noticing it's happening. Psychologist Robert Zions demonstrated this phenomenon by exposing participants to unfamiliar shapes, words, and faces over and over again. They weren't asked to interact with them, understand them, or even think about them. All they had to do was see them, and with each repeated exposure, something remarkable occurred. The participants began to like these once foreign images more. What was strange at first became comforting. What felt neutral began to feel warm. What was unfamiliar slowly felt safe. This experiment exposes a truth that hits deeper than most people realize. The human mind is drawn to what it knows, even if what it knows isn't extraordinary. Familiarity breeds fondness. It softens defenses, quiets suspicion, and creates an emotional pull that feels natural but is actually manufactured by repetition. It explains why songs grow on us, why brands become trusted, why faces begin to feel attractive simply because they appear again and again in our orbit. But beneath this gentle finding lies a darker emotional reality. The Mere Exposure Effect reveals why people stay in comfortable but unfulfilling relationships, why they cling to routines that no longer serve them, and why they fear change even when they crave it. Familiarity becomes a psychological cocoon, warm, predictable, and suffocating all at once. This study forces us to confront how fragile our preferences truly are, how easily they can be shaped by repetition rather than reason, and how often we mistake comfort for connection simply because something or someone has been near us long enough to feel like home. The Serial Position Memory Effect. The Serial Position Memory Effect reveals a quietly heartbreaking truth about how our minds handle the moments we live through. We rarely remember everything. We remember the beginning, the end, and only fragments of the middle. In this experiment, participants were given lists of words to memorize. Without fail, they consistently recalled the first few items with surprising ease and the last ones almost effortlessly, while the words in the center faded into a quiet blur. The pattern was so reliable it became undeniable. The mind clings tightly to what comes first, and it won't let go of what comes last, but everything in between can slip away without us even realizing it. What makes this study so emotionally striking is how deeply it mirrors real life. People often remember the start of a relationship, the spark, the excitement, as clearly as the final moments when things fell apart, but the long stretch in the middle, the everyday details that once felt so important, dissolve into something hazy. Childhood memories work the same way. Sharp flashes from the early years, vivid scenes from recent times, and an ocean of missing moments lying quietly in between. The Serial Position Effect shows that memory isn't a perfect recorder. It's a storyteller that chooses what to keep and what to forget. The experiment exposes how fragile our experiences truly are. Moments we thought we'd hold forever slip through unnoticed, while others are anchored permanently for reasons we may never fully understand. It reveals the mind's strange tendency to treasure beginnings and endings, leaving the middle, where most of life actually happens, to fade into soft, unreachable shadows. The Boundary Extension Visual Memory Study. The Boundary Extension Visual Memory Study is one of the most quietly unsettling discoveries in psychology, because it reveals that our minds don't just remember reality, they expand it, filling in the world beyond what we actually see. Conducted by Intraub and Richardson In the 1980s, the experiment began with something deceptively simple. Participants viewed photographs of scenes cropped tightly around a single object, like a close-up of a car, a room, or a landscape. After only moments of exposure, they were asked to recall or redraw the images. What happened was astonishing. People consistently remembered seeing more than what was shown. They added space, background, scenery, details that were never there. Their minds stretched the boundaries outward, as if the world in the photo continued beyond the edges, even though it didn't. What makes this phenomenon so emotionally powerful is what it reveals about the way we experience life. The mind refuses to accept the limits of a moment. It fills in gaps, extends edges, and creates a larger story because uncertainty feels too small, too confined, too incomplete. Boundary extension shows that our memories are not photographs. They are interpretations shaped by expectation, imagination, and the deep human need for coherence. We don't just store the world, we reconstruct it. And beneath this lies an even deeper truth. The mind is constantly trying to protect us from the discomfort of the unknown. It stretches reality to make sense of it, even when doing so distorts the truth. The boundary extension study exposes how effortlessly our memories blur into assumptions, how quickly imagination masquerades as fact, and how often we trust recollections that were never fully real to begin with. The construal level psychological distance study. The construal level psychological distance study reveals a breathtaking truth about the mind. The farther away something feels, whether in time, space, or emotion, the more our brain reshapes it into something simpler, softer, and often dangerously inaccurate. Psychologists discovered that when people think about events that are close to them, they process them with vivid detail, feeling every consequence, every texture, every emotional ripple. But when the same events are imagined as distant, tomorrow becomes next year, a nearby person becomes a stranger, a personal issue becomes someone else's problem. The mind drifts into abstraction. The vivid becomes vague. The urgent becomes theoretical. The emotional becomes detached. What makes this study so emotionally gripping is how profoundly it explains the disconnect between what we believe we'll do and what we actually do. When something is far away, we imagine ourselves calm, disciplined, heroic, untouched by fear or temptation. But when the moment finally arrives, reality hits with a force our simplified fantasies never prepared us for. We overpromise to our future selves, underestimate challenges, and overlook pain because distance tricks us into believing life will be easier than it is. This psychological distance shapes our relationships too. We care deeply for people close to us, yet struggle to feel the same intensity for suffering happening across the world, not because we're cold, but because distance numbs emotional clarity. It reveals why we procrastinate, why we judge others harshly, why we make plans we later abandon, and why the future always feels cleaner and more manageable than the present. The construal level study exposes the unsettling truth that the mind edits reality depending on how close or far it feels, showing that our greatest misunderstandings often come not from ignorance, but from the quiet distortions created by distance itself. The illusion of truth repetition study. The illusion of truth repetition study is one of the most unsettling demonstrations of how easily the mind can be deceived, not by evidence, logic, or clarity, but by something as simple as repetition. Psychologists first uncovered this effect by presenting participants with statements that were a mix of true and false. Some statements were repeated several times throughout the experiment, while others appeared only once. What happened next was both fascinating and deeply troubling. The more often participants heard a statement, regardless of whether it was true, the more believable it became. Familiarity started masquerading as truth. Words that were false began to feel honest. Lies wrapped in repetition felt safer, more trustworthy, more real. This experiment exposes a chilling psychological vulnerability. The human brain confuses familiarity with accuracy. The mind takes shortcuts, relying on ease of processing rather than critical thinking, and anything repeated enough times begins to glide smoothly through our cognition. That smoothness feels like certainty. It feels like truth. What makes this study so emotionally gripping is how clearly it mirrors the world we live in. It explains why rumors spread like wildfire, why propaganda works, why advertising hooks us, and why people cling to beliefs that crumble under scrutiny. The repetition doesn't just influence what we think, it shapes who we become. It rewires our sense of reality, nudging us toward ideas simply because they echo loudly and often. The illusion of truth effect forces us to face a disturbing fact. Our confidence in what we know may be nothing more than the residue of repetition. It reveals how fragile truth can feel when the mind is soothed by familiarity, and how easily the world can manipulate our beliefs simply by saying the same thing again and again until it feels undeniably real. The Delay Discounting Hyperbolic Choice Study. The Delay Discounting Hyperbolic Choice Study reveals a profound and unsettling truth about human desire. When the future competes with the present almost always wins, no matter how much it costs us later. In this experiment, participants were given choices between a small reward available immediately and a much larger reward available after a delay. Logic insists we should wait. A bigger reward is obviously better. Yet again and again, people chose the smaller, instant prize. The brain lights up for now with a force that overpowers long-term reasoning, making waiting feel like a kind of quiet suffering. Even when the delayed reward was dramatically better, participants struggled, torn between who they were in the moment and who they hoped to be later. What makes this study so emotionally gripping is how deeply it reflects the battles we fight within ourselves, choosing sleep over ambition, choosing comfort over discipline, choosing relief over resilience. The study shows that the mind discounts the future at a hyperbolic rate, meaning a reward loses its emotional power the moment it's placed even slightly out of reach. The future becomes distant, blurry, almost unreal, while the present feels loud, urgent, and irresistible. Participants describe feeling frustration, temptation, even guilt, as though they were betraying their better judgment while being pulled toward the immediate reward by something instinctive and primal. The Delay Discounting Study exposes a painful truth. The hardest battles are not against the world, but against our own impulses. It reveals how easily long-term dreams can be sacrificed for short-term comfort, how the mind warps value when patience is required, and how the future self is often left begging for choices the present self refuses to make. The Good Judgment Project Forecasting Study. The Good Judgment Project Forecasting Study is one of the most astonishing demonstrations of how the human mind can cut through uncertainty, not with credentials, power, or status, but with clarity, humility, and an openness to being wrong. Launched by Philip Tetlock and his team, the project brought together tens of thousands of ordinary people and asked them to make predictions about global events, wars, elections, economic shifts, crises that even experts struggle to forecast. No training, no insider access, no elite background, just human judgment tested on one of the world's most unpredictable stages. And then something unbelievable happened. Among these everyday individuals emerged super forecasters, people whose predictions weren't just good, they were shockingly accurate, outperforming intelligence analysts with classified information. What makes this study so emotionally powerful is what it reveals about where true insight comes from. The best forecasters weren't arrogant or rigid. They were fiercely curious, constantly updating their beliefs, willing to change their minds the instant new evidence appeared. They didn't cling to identity or certainty. They embraced uncertainty, treating it like a puzzle instead of a threat. Their brilliance wasn't loud. It was humble. It was flexible. It was human. The Good Judgment Project shatters the myth that intuition alone guides us or that expertise guarantees clarity. It shows that wisdom lives in those who question, who revise, who think slowly when others rush. It exposes the quiet power of open-mindedness, revealing that the ability to see the future doesn't come from knowing everything. It comes from being willing to let go of what you think you know. The sunk cost fallacy experiments. The sunk cost fallacy experiments expose one of the most quietly destructive forces in human decision-making, our deep emotional refusal to let go of what we've already invested, even when holding on is hurting us. In these studies, participants were presented with choices involving time, money, effort, or relationships. Logic said they should walk away when something no longer served them. But the moment people were reminded of how much they had already put in, the hours spent, the money paid, the sacrifices made, everything changed. They clung tighter. They doubled down. They chose the losing path simply because abandoning it felt like admitting their past investment was wasted. What makes these experiments so emotionally piercing is how painfully familiar their results are. The participants weren't irrational. They were human. They stayed in failing projects because of pride. They kept pouring money into doomed ventures because quitting felt like defeat. They held onto broken relationships because of the memories they had built, even when those memories were the only thing left holding the structure together. The experiments revealed that it isn't the future we're afraid of. It's the past we can't bear to invalidate. The sunk cost fallacy shows that people will endure discomfort, disappointment, and even suffering rather than face the emotional sting of letting go. It explains why we force ourselves through jobs that drain us, cling to commitments that no longer fit, and stay loyal to choices that have long since stopped being right. The mind twists sacrifice into justification, convincing us that walking away means everything we invested was meaningless. These studies reveal the haunting truth that sometimes the hardest part of moving forward isn't the uncertainty ahead. It's the courage required to release the weight of what we've already given. The Anchoring Bias Pricing Study. The Anchoring Bias Pricing Study is one of the most striking demonstrations of how a single number, no matter how arbitrary, can quietly hijack the human mind and reshape every judgment that follows. Psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman uncovered this effect by showing participants meaningless numbers, like the spin of a wheel rigged to land on random digits, and then asking them to estimate something completely unrelated, such as the percentage of African nations in the United Nations. What happened next was shocking. Those who saw a high number gave higher estimates. Those who saw a low number gave lower ones. A number with no value, no logic, and no connection to reality became the invisible anchor that pulled their thinking toward it. This study exposes a psychological trap we all fall into. The first number we encounter becomes the lens through which we interpret everything else. A high initial price makes a discount feel irresistible. A high salary expectation makes an offer seem reasonable. Even a random suggestion can warp our sense of what something is worth. The mind clings to the anchor instinctively, desperately, using it as a starting point because uncertainty feels unbearable. What makes this experiment so emotionally unsettling is how profoundly it shapes everyday life. People overpay because an inflated, original price tricks their judgment. They underestimate risk because an early assumption muffles their caution. They fall for manipulation because anchors sneak in disguised as harmless information. The anchoring bias reveals how fragile our sense of value truly is, how easily it bends under the weight of the first number we see, and how often our decisions are guided not by reason, but by the echoes of an anchor we never meant to grab onto in the first place. The Change Blindness Door Study. The Change Blindness Door Study uncovers a startling truth about human perception. We believe we are paying attention, but our minds miss far more than we ever realize. In this experiment, a researcher approached unsuspecting strangers to ask for directions. While they were speaking, two people carrying a large door abruptly walked between them, blocking the view for just a moment. What the participant didn't know was that the original questioner secretly swapped places with a completely different person during the interruption. The change was dramatic. Different height, different clothes, different face, even a different voice. Yet most people didn't notice anything at all. They continued giving directions as if nothing had changed, completely unaware they were now speaking to someone entirely new. What makes this study so emotionally gripping is the uncomfortable truth it forces us to face. Our confidence in our own awareness is an illusion. We move through the world believing we see everything that matters, when in reality, our minds only process a thin slice of the overwhelming information around us. The rest slips away unnoticed, hidden behind the brain's desperate attempt to conserve energy. Participants later insisted they would have noticed such a dramatic change, but the recordings proved otherwise. Their certainty was built on nothing more than assumption. The Change Blindness Door Study reveals how fragile our perception truly is, how easily the brain fills in gaps without our permission, and how much of reality we overlook while believing we're fully present. It exposes a quiet vulnerability that the world can shift right in front of our eyes, and our minds, without warning, can fail to notice the difference. The Hyder-Simmel Animation Attribution Study. The Hyder-Simmel Animation Attribution Study is one of the most hauntingly beautiful revelations of the human mind's need to find meaning, even where none exists. Conducted in 1944 by Fritz Heider and Marianne Simmel, the experiment showed participants a simple animation: two triangles and a circle moving around a box. No faces, no voices, no emotion, just shapes drifting across a screen. And yet, what people saw was astonishing. They didn't describe geometry. They described stories. The big triangle became a bully. The small triangle became a hero. The circle became frightened, trapped, or desperate for escape. A silent dance of shapes transformed into drama, conflict, courage, intimidation, and heartbreak, as if every movement carried a soul. What makes this study so profoundly emotional is what it uncovers about the human heart. We are wired to breathe intention into the world around us. We see motives in motion, personalities in patterns, and stories in randomness. It's not imagination, it's instinct. Our minds refuse to see life as empty or mechanical. Instead, they reach for narrative, for purpose, for emotional logic. Even in soulless shapes, we project pieces of our own fears, hopes, memories, and wounds. The Hyder-Simmel study exposes a truth as fragile as it is powerful. Humans are natural storytellers, not just about the world, but about each other. We interpret glances as judgments, pauses as rejection, silence as anger. We read minds that aren't speaking and intentions that may not exist because it feels safer to live in a world filled with meaning than in a world filled with uncertainty. The shapes on the screen were never alive, but the stories people saw in them revealed just how alive their inner worlds truly were. The Minimal Group Paradigm. The minimal group paradigm is one of the most disturbing discoveries in social psychology, revealing just how effortlessly the human mind divides the world into us and them. Henri Tajfel designed the experiment to be almost absurdly simple. Participants were randomly assigned to groups based on meaningless criteria, like preferring one abstract painting over another, or even a random coin toss. These groups had no history, no shared identity, no reason to feel loyalty or rivalry. And yet, something startling happened. The moment people learned their group label, They began favoring their own side. They allocated more rewards to their in-group, withheld resources from the out-group, and made decisions that benefited people like them, even when it cost everyone collectively. What makes this experiment so emotionally jarring is how quickly these imaginary divisions took root. The participants weren't protecting culture, beliefs, or values. They were protecting nothing, labels created out of thin air. Still, the bias grew instantly, instinctively, as if the mind were desperate to belong to something, anything, even at the expense of fairness and empathy. The minimal group paradigm exposes a haunting truth about human nature. Prejudice doesn't require history, conflict, or threat. It doesn't need justification. It only needs categories. The smallest hint of difference, real or invented, is enough for the brain to construct invisible walls and guard them fiercely. This study explains why school cliques form overnight, why companies fracture into departments, why nations divide, and why humans so easily slip into rivalry with people they barely know. The experiment forces us to confront the unsettling realization that division is not learned. It's awakened, and once awakened, it shapes loyalty, perception, and morality far more powerfully than we like to admit. The Capuchin Monkey Fairness Study. The Capuchin Monkey Fairness Study is one of the most emotionally explosive demonstrations of how deeply the instinct for fairness runs, not just in humans, but across species. Conducted by Franz de Waal and Sarah Brosnan, the experiment began with two capuchin monkeys performing a simple task in exchange for food. At first, both received cucumber slices, and both were perfectly content. But then something extraordinary happened. One monkey was suddenly given grapes, the superior reward, while the other continued receiving cucumbers for the exact same work. The reaction was immediate, visceral, and unforgettable. The monkey who received the lesser reward froze in disbelief, stared at the grape given to its partner, then looked at the cucumber in its own hand as if it were an insult, and then, in an eruption of frustration, it hurled the cucumber back at the researcher, slammed the table, rattled the cage, and demanded fairness with every fiber of its being. What makes this study so powerful is how raw and human the reaction feels. The monkey wasn't hungry. It wasn't mistreated. Nothing had changed except comparison. The moment inequality appeared, contentment shattered. This reveals a profound psychological truth. Unfairness wounds us at an emotional, almost primal level. It ignites anger, resentment, and a deep sense of betrayal. The Capuchin Fairness Study mirrors everything from workplace frustration to sibling rivalry, from relationship imbalances to societal injustice. It exposes how strongly we crave equality, how instinctively we rebel when others receive what we feel we deserve, and how comparison can turn satisfaction into fury in seconds. It shows that fairness isn't a learned concept. It's a biological demand, wired deep into the emotional core of living beings. The Social Contagion Yawning Study. The Social Contagion Yawning Study reveals a strangely intimate truth about human connection. Our bodies mirror each other long before our minds even realize it. In this experiment, researchers explored why seeing someone yawn, whether in person, on video, or even just hearing about it, causes many people to yawn as well. It's such a small, almost silly action, yet beneath it lies something profoundly emotional. Participants reported feeling an irresistible urge rising in their chests when watching someone else yawn, as if their bodies were quietly syncing up with another person's state. The most fascinating part was that yawning contagion didn't happen randomly. It was strongest among people who felt empathy, closeness, or understanding toward others. What makes this study so emotionally powerful is what it implies about the human mind. Contagious yawning isn't about tiredness, it's about connection. It's the brain whispering, "I feel what you feel," even when the feeling is something as simple as fatigue. Researchers found that people who struggled with emotional attunement yawned less when others did, while those with deep empathy reacted instantly, their bodies responding as if they were sharing the same internal state. It suggests that yawning contagion might be a primitive form of emotional resonance, a glimpse into how deeply we are wired to mirror each other's experiences. This study exposes the quiet, invisible threads that tie us together. It shows that our bodies are constantly reading, absorbing, and reflecting the states of those around us, even in the smallest gestures. The social contagion yawning. Study reminds us that connection isn't always spoken. It's often biological, instinctive, and beautifully automatic, revealing how profoundly we are built to feel with one another. The Implicit Association Test, IAT. The Implicit Association Test is one of the most deeply unsettling experiments ever created because it exposes the hidden biases buried beneath the surface of our conscious beliefs, biases we deny, suppress, or don't even know exist. Developed by Anthony Greenwald and Mahzarin Banaji in the 1990s, the test asks participants to quickly sort words or images into categories, pairing concepts like good or bad with faces, genders, or social groups. On the surface, it feels like a simple reaction time task, nothing more than clicking keys in rapid succession. But beneath that simplicity lies a jarring revelation. The speed of your reactions reveals the secret associations your mind has already formed. People who genuinely believe they are fair, open-minded, and unbiased often discover something painful. Their brains connect certain groups with negativity faster than others, not because they are hateful, but because they have absorbed years of cultural messages, stereotypes, media images, and unspoken social cues. The test doesn't expose malicious intent. It exposes the quiet residue of a world that teaches us what to fear, what to trust, and what to expect long before we ever question it. What makes the IAT so emotionally powerful is the way it forces us to confront a part of ourselves we never meant to create. It shows that prejudice doesn't only live in hatred. It can live in reflexes, in split-second judgments, in subconscious pathways shaped by experience rather than choice. The test reveals a truth both uncomfortable and liberating. Our conscious values and our unconscious associations are not always aligned, and within that gap lies the real battleground of human morality, a place where we are challenged to unlearn, rewire, and face the shadows we didn't know were ours. The Power Pose Confidence Study. The Power Pose Confidence Study is one of the most captivating demonstrations of how the body can shape the mind in ways we rarely notice. Amy Cuddy and her colleagues discovered that simply standing in a posture of power, feet planted, chest open, arms expanded, could create a surge of confidence strong enough to influence behavior, decisions, and even risk-taking. Participants who held these expansive poses for just 2 minutes walked into stressful situations feeling bolder, clearer, and more in control, while those who curled inward, shrinking their bodies, felt more anxious and uncertain. What makes this study so emotionally gripping is the idea that confidence isn't always born from achievement or experience. Sometimes it begins with the way we inhabit our own physical space. The body whispers signals to the brain, and the brain listens. For many participants, this tiny shift in posture sparked an internal transformation. They spoke more assertively, made choices with greater conviction, and faced challenges with a steadiness they didn't know they had. Their body language didn't just reflect their emotions, it shaped them. It revealed how deeply our sense of power can be influenced by how much space we allow ourselves to occupy. But beneath this inspiring finding lies something even more profound. Most people go through life physically shrinking themselves when they need confidence the most. They fold their arms, hunch their shoulders, hide their hands, and make themselves small without realizing the psychological costs. The The study exposes how the mind and body are bound together in a silent conversation, and how easily we forget that sometimes strength isn't something we wait to feel, it's something we step into even before we believe it belongs to us. The false fame illusion experiment. The false fame illusion experiment is one of the most haunting revelations of how the mind can transform ordinary, unknown people into famous figures simply because their names feel familiar. Psychologist Larry Jacoby and his colleagues discovered this effect by first showing participants a list of completely ordinary fictional names. No celebrities, no public figures, just random names flashed briefly on a screen. The next day, participants were shown a new list of names mixed with actual famous individuals, strangers, and the fictional names they had seen before. What happened next was startling. The participants began labeling the old, fictional names as famous, not because they remembered seeing them, but because the names felt familiar in a way they couldn't explain. Their brains confused recognition with importance. The mind took that tiny spark of familiarity and inflated it into a sense of significance, transforming nobodies into supposed celebrities, and the people confidently swore they knew them from somewhere meaningful. This experiment exposes a deeply emotional vulnerability in human cognition. We trust the feeling of familiarity even when it misleads us. Our brains crave shortcuts, and recognition feels safer than uncertainty, so the mind quietly fills in the blanks, creating stories where none exist. What makes this study so unsettling is how easily this illusion seeps into real life. It explains why rumors become facts, why repeated lies feel true, why persuasive figures can gain credibility simply by being seen often, and why people mistake repetition for reputation. The false fame illusion reveals that our sense of who is important, trustworthy, or influential isn't always built on truth. It's built on the whisper of recognition, a cognitive echo that convinces us we know someone even when we absolutely don't. The ego depletion radish versus cookies study. The ego depletion radish versus cookies study reveals a deeply human struggle hidden inside the mind. Self-control is not an endless resource. It drains, weakens, and leaves us vulnerable in ways we rarely notice. In this experiment, hungry participants were placed in a room filled with the irresistible smell of freshly baked cookies. Some were allowed to indulge, savoring the warm sweetness without restraint. Others, however, were forced to ignore the cookies and eat plain radishes instead, denying themselves the comfort and pleasure their bodies craved. What the researchers discovered next was startling. When both groups were given a difficult, frustrating puzzle afterward, the cookie eaters persisted far longer, fighting through the challenge with patience and determination. But those who had resisted the cookies gave up quickly, their willpower seemingly drained by the simple act of saying no. What makes this study so emotionally gripping is what it reveals about the hidden cost of self-restraint. Every moment of resistance, every temptation we suppress, every emotion we swallow, every impulse we fight, quietly drains our mental strength. The radish group wasn't weaker. They were exhausted. Their willpower had already been spent battling temptation before they ever touched the puzzle. It exposes a truth we feel but rarely articulate. Self-control is like a muscle, powerful yet exhaustible, capable of lifting us through challenges but vulnerable to fatigue. The ego depletion study shines a painful light on the moments when we blame ourselves for giving up, slipping, or losing patience. It shows that sometimes failure isn't a flaw in character, but a consequence of invisible exhaustion, reminding us that even the strongest minds can falter when stretched too thin. The Dunning-Kruger Competence Study. The Dunning-Kruger Competence Study is one of the most uncomfortable psychological revelations ever uncovered because it exposes the quiet, dangerous gap between what we think we know and what we actually understand. conducted by David Dunning and Justin Kruger in the late 1990s. The study asked participants to complete tests in logic, grammar, and humor, tasks that seemed straightforward, familiar, even easy. Afterwards, participants were asked to rate their own performance. The results were painfully revealing. Those who performed the worst believed they had done exceptionally well. They weren't just slightly off. They dramatically overestimated their abilities, unaware of how much they didn't know. It wasn't arrogance, it was blindness. Their lack of skill had robbed them of the ability to recognize their own mistakes. What makes this study so emotionally striking is how deeply it resonates with the human experience. We've all met someone who speaks with unshakable confidence, yet has no idea how little they truly understand. But the study forces us to face a far more unsettling truth. We have all been that person at some point. The human mind protects itself by filling in gaps with certainty, telling us we're competent even when we're lost. It's a survival instinct, a shield against self-doubt, but it can lead us into decisions, arguments, and failures we never saw coming. The Dunning-Kruger effect isn't about stupidity, it's about vulnerability. It reveals how easily we can mistake familiarity for expertise, how quickly confidence can outgrow competence, and how often our strongest convictions are built on the weakest foundations. It shows that the most dangerous ignorance is the kind we don't recognize, the kind that whispers, "You already know enough," just when we most desperately need to learn. The misleading post-event information study. The misleading post-event information study is one of the most unsettling revelations about how easily our memories can be bent and twisted by the world around us, even after the moment has passed. Conducted by Elizabeth Loftus, the study exposed participants to an event, such as a car accident or a staged crime, and later introduced subtle but incorrect details in the form of questions, suggestions, or conversations. What happened next was chilling. People began remembering details that never existed. A stop sign became a yield sign, a screwdriver became a hammer, a harmless gesture became a threatening one. Their recollections weren't being retrieved, they were being rewritten. What makes this study so emotionally gripping is the realization that memory isn't a vault where moments are stored untouched. It is fragile, permeable, and terrifyingly open to influence. Participants weren't gullible, they were human. Their minds absorbed new information and blended it with the original event until the two became inseparable. They felt certain, confident, even adamant about details that had been planted in their minds like quiet seeds of suggestion. This phenomenon reveals how vulnerable we are during moments of confusion, stress, or uncertainty. After a chaotic event, people look to others for clarity, and in that search, their memories can shift to align with what they hear. It explains why eyewitness testimony can be dangerously unreliable, why arguments escalate over memories that feel undeniably true, and why people can be convinced they saw something that never happened at all. The misleading post-event information study forces us to confront a painful truth. Our past is not fixed. It can be edited, distorted, or overwritten by the slightest whisper of suggestion, leaving us trusting memories that may have been quietly rewritten by someone else's words. The Cocktail Party Effect Study. The Cocktail Party Effect Study is one of the most mesmerizing demonstrations of how the human mind can focus with razor-sharp precision on what matters to it, while ignoring a sea of noise that should be impossible to tune out. Psychologists studying selective attention discovered this phenomenon by observing what happens in crowded, noisy environments where dozens of conversations, clinking glasses, and background chaos all blend into one overwhelming soundscape. Yet in the middle of that chaos, something extraordinary happens. The moment someone across the room says your name, your attention snaps to it instantly, as if your brain had been secretly listening the entire time. This study reveals a deeply emotional truth about the mind. Even when we think we're not paying attention, a hidden part of us is always scanning for what feels personal, meaningful, or threatening. It's the brain's way of protecting us, guiding us, and reminding us that not all noise is equal. What seems irrelevant is filtered out, dismissed, erased, and what touches our identity cuts through the clutter like a spotlight. But the most haunting part of this phenomenon is how selective attention shapes our lives far beyond parties. It explains why we hear criticism louder than praise, why certain words from certain people can pierce us instantly, and why our minds latch onto emotional triggers even when we try to ignore them. The cocktail party effect exposes how much of our world we overlook, how selectively we experience reality, and how our brains choose what deserves our awareness long before we consciously decide. It reminds us that attention isn't just about what we focus on, it's about what our mind refuses to let us miss, no matter how loudly the rest of the world tries to drown it out.